Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. Not born in armor, the long, boring road to becoming a knight. When you imagine a medieval knight, you likely picture a man already grown, broad-shouldered, armored, mounted on a war horse, moving with purpose towards some dramatic clash of steel. What you almost never picture is the childhood that came before. And that childhood, slow and repetitive, shaped everything about what knighthood really was. Most knights were not born knights. They were born boys, often the second or third sons of minor landholding families, into a world where inheritance was narrow and options were limited. If you were not set to inherit land, you were expected to be useful. Knighthood was not a romantic calling. It was a career track, chosen early, enforced quietly, and followed with discipline. If you were born into a family tied to the military elite of medieval Western Europe, your future began unfolding before you could read or write. Around the age of 7, sometimes earlier, you would be sent away from home, not to be trained with swords but to learn obedience. You became a page. This was not a title of honor, it was a role of service. As a page, you lived in the household of a lord, often someone to whom your family owed loyalty. Your days were structured, repetitive, and deliberately dull. You rose early. You carried messages. You held doors. You stood silently during meals. You learned how to pour wine without spilling it, how to carve meat properly, how to remain invisible unless spoken to. What you were really learning was restraint. The medieval world valued hierarchy above all else. Before you were trusted with a weapon, you had to demonstrate that you understood your place. You were watched constantly, not just for skill, but for posture, tone, patience. A boy who spoke out of turn or showed temper could be sent home in disgrace. That disgrace followed families for generations. Your body was also being shaped slowly, without ceremony. You ran errands across stone courtyards. You carried heavy trays. You slept on hard surfaces. No one called this training, but it was. Strength was built quietly through repetition and fatigue. Formal education, when it existed, was practical. You might learn basic prayers in Latin, enough to follow the rhythm of the church. You might learn numbers, enough to track supplies or land boundaries. Reading for pleasure was rare. Curiosity was tolerated only when it served discipline. By your early teens, if you had not failed or been dismissed, you advanced. Now you became a squire. This is where modern imagination often begins, but the reality remains stubbornly unglamorous. As a squire, you were assigned to a specific knight. Your job was not to fight. Your job was to support someone who did. You cleaned armor, not occasionally, daily. Armor rusted quickly. Sweat soaked into padding. Leather stiffened and cracked. If armor failed in battle, the fault might fall on you. That knowledge followed you like a weight. You tended horses. War horses were expensive, temperamental, and dangerous. You learned how to feed them properly, how to check their hooves, how to calm them after noise and chaos. Many squires were injured not in combat, but by kicks, bites, or being crushed against stable walls. Only after years of this did weapon training become serious. Even then, it was repetitive and restrained. Wooden swords, blunted lances, endless drills. Footwork mattered more than force, balance more than strength. You fell often. You bruised constantly. Complaining marked you as weak. What history books often hide is how long this phase lasted. A boy might serve as a squire for 7 to 10 years. That is nearly a decade of preparation before any recognition, and recognition was never guaranteed. Knighthood was expensive. Someone had to pay for the ceremony, the armor, the horse, the sword. Many squires reached adulthood without ever being knighted, not because they failed, but because no one could afford it. They remained squires into their 30s, respected but incomplete, waiting for opportunity. Some never received it at all. A rare example of upward mobility survives in the life of William Marshall, often remembered as the greatest knight. His childhood included being held hostage as a bargaining tool during a civil war. His early training was harsh, uncertain, and dangerous. His later fame obscures how fragile his path truly was. Most knights never became legends. They became functionaries of violence trained carefully, slowly, and without drama. By the time you were eligible for knighthood, likely in your early 20s, your body already carried damage. Old fractures, worn joints, scars that never fully healed. The training that made you resilient also made you tired. The ceremony itself, when it came, was brief. A vigil, a blessing, a blow to the shoulder, no cheering crowds, no music. By dawn, you were expected to behave exactly as before, only now mistakes carried greater consequences. And this raises an uncomfortable question that medieval chroniclers rarely asked directly. If knighthood required such long, quiet preparation, such obedience, such endurance, what kind of men did it actually produce? As you stand at the edge of adulthood, armor cleaned, sword sharpened, waiting for a title that may or may not come, you might begin to wonder, was all this preparation truly for glory, or simply for survival in a rigid world that allowed little choice? By the time you were close to being knighted, the training had already done its quiet work on you. There was no clear moment when preparation ended and knighthood began. Instead, there was a long stretch of waiting for permission, waiting for resources, waiting for the right political moment. This waiting was not a pause in your life. It was your life. As a squire approaching adulthood, your days followed a pattern that rarely changed. You rose early, often before sunrise, because the household did. Fires had to be lit, animals fed, equipment checked. You learned quickly that neglecting small tasks had consequences far out of proportion to their size. A loose strap on a saddle could mean a fall. A poorly dried mail shirt could rust overnight. These were not abstract lessons. You saw the results. Weapon training intensified, but not in the way stories often suggest. You did not spend hours dueling dramatically in open fields. Instead, you practiced the same movements again and again. How to mount a horse while wearing weight. How to lower a lance without overbalancing. How to strike with a sword without exhausting yourself in the first few minutes. Efficiency mattered more than strength. A knight who tired quickly was a liability. Much of this training took place in silence. Commands were short. Corrections were physical, and adjusted grip, a shove to reposition your feet. Praise was rare and brief. You were not being trained to feel confident. You were being trained to function under pressure without thinking. One of the most misunderstood aspects of knightly training was the emphasis on endurance. Battles, when they occurred, were chaotic and brief, but campaigns were not. You might ride for weeks, sleep poorly, eat badly, and then be expected to fight at the end of it. Training reflected this reality. Long hours in armor, marches with full kit, repeated drills after exhaustion had already set in. You learned how your body failed. You learned which muscles cramped first, how hunger affected your balance, how fear narrowed your vision. None of this was discussed openly. You were expected to notice it yourself and compensate quietly. There was also the matter of discipline beyond combat. Knights were not only fighters, they were symbols of authority. That authority had to be controlled. A knight who lost his temper could start feuds. A knight who drank too much could embarrass his lord. As a squire, you were watched for signs of excess gambling, uncontrolled desire, disobedience. Punishments were often subtle. Extra duties, delayed advancement, a quiet withdrawal of favor. In a world built on reputation, these were serious setbacks. Religion filled the gaps left by uncertainty. You attended daily prayers not because of deep personal conviction, but because it structured time. The repetition of words, the rhythm of services, the calendar of saints, days, all of it created a sense of order in a life that otherwise involved constant waiting. Knights were taught that patience was a virtue. In reality, it was a necessity. Most days passed without incident. No battles, no ceremonies, just maintenance of equipment, of horses, of relationships. You learned who mattered in the household and who did not. You learned how to listen when powerful men spoke casually, because casual remarks often carried instructions. The wider world intruded occasionally. News traveled slowly, but when it arrived, it shaped futures. A lord's death, a marriage alliance, a dispute over land. These events could suddenly make a knight necessary or unnecessary. Many squires spent years ready for war that never came. This period of inactivity was not wasted. It hardened habits. You learned how to stay alert while appearing relaxed. You learned how to occupy long hours without complaint. You learned how to measure your words. Some squires sought distraction. Hunting was common, though regulated. Tournaments existed, but participation was limited and risky. Injury in a tournament could end a career before it began. Most avoided unnecessary chances. There was also fear, rarely spoken, always present. Fear of being knighted without support. Fear of never being knighted at all. Fear of being sent to fight for a cause you did not understand in a place you had never seen. The medieval world was not large, but it was dangerous. Knights in training were acutely aware of cost. Armor was not issued, it was owned. Horses were investments. Weapons required upkeep. Debt followed many knights throughout their lives. You learned to calculate risk not only in terms of survival, but in terms of financial ruin. A captured knight could be ransomed. A dead one left his family with nothing. In regions shaped by feudal obligations like Normandy, knights were tied to land as much as to war. Service was expected but limited. Campaigns had defined seasons. When those seasons ended, you returned not to rest but to management, repairs, accounts, disputes among peasants, authority expressed through routine decisions. This was another lesson of training. Violence was only one tool, and often the least useful one. By the time knighthood approached, if it did at all, you had learned to think in terms of obligation rather than desire. You knew where you stood in the hierarchy. You knew whom you owed loyalty to. You knew what was expected and what was forbidden. The vigil before knighthood, often described as a spiritual turning point, was also practical. You stood watch over your equipment. You reflected not only on faith, but on the reality of what came next. Once knighted, you could be called upon at any time. You could no longer hide behind apprenticeship. And yet, even at this moment, nothing felt resolved. You had trained for years, endured boredom, discipline, and uncertainty, only to arrive at a threshold that did not promise clarity, only responsibility. As dawn approached and the ceremony loomed, a quiet question lingered beneath the ritual. After all this preparation, what would knighthood actually demand of you when waiting finally ended? When knighthood finally arrived, it rarely felt like a beginning. It felt more like a quiet shift in weight, as though the same life you had already been living had been placed more firmly on your shoulders. The ceremony itself was simple by design. Complexity belonged to the church and to kings. Knighthood was practical. You bathed, symbolically washing away childhood. You kept vigil through the night, standing or kneeling beside the tools of your trade: sword, armor, spurs, items you already knew intimately. There was no mystery left in them. You knew where the leather pinched, where the metal rubbed raw. You had repaired them too many times to feel awe. At dawn, a lord or sometimes a higher-ranking knight spoke a few words. You knelt. A sword touched your shoulder. An oath was taken. The words varied by region and era, but the meaning was consistent: service, loyalty, restraint. Then you stood, and almost nothing changed. You ate breakfast, you checked your horse, you waited for instructions. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about medieval knighthood. The title did not grant purpose. Purpose came from circumstance, and circumstance was unpredictable. Many newly knighted men spent their first months doing exactly what they had done as squires, only now they bore responsibility for their own actions. You were expected to provide your own equipment. If your armor was outdated, that was your problem. If your horse went lame, that was your expense. Lords did not maintain knights, they used them. This distinction mattered deeply. Knighthood placed you in a narrow social category. You were above common soldiers, but below true nobility. You could dine in the hall, but you rarely spoke freely. You had authority over peasants, but you answered to landowners. Your position depended on constant demonstration of usefulness. War, when it came, was rarely glorious. Campaigns began slowly. Messages were sent, men gathered, supplies were counted and found lacking. Weeks passed. You rode with others like you men trained in silence, accustomed to boredom, alert to small changes. Much of war was movement without action. Mud, rain, sickness, arguments over precedence. When fighting did occur, it was brief and confusing. Noise swallowed commands. Dust and smoke obscured vision. Training took over because thought could not. The careful drills of youth, the endless repetition, were what carried you through moments of fear. Survival depended less on bravery than on position, staying with your group, knowing when to advance and when to hold. Knights who chased individual glory often died quickly. This was understood, even if songs later ignored it. Capture was common. Death, while always possible, was not always the goal. Knights were valuable alive. Ransom was a system, and everyone knew the rules. Being taken prisoner meant weeks or months of waiting, negotiating through intermediaries, hopping your family or lord could pay. Those who could not were sometimes kept indefinitely. Others were released on parole, bound by honor to return if payment failed. These arrangements relied on reputation more than force. And reputation was fragile. A single act of cruelty, a broken oath, an accusation of cowardice, any of these could undo decades of careful behavior. Knighthood offered status, but it demanded constant self-regulation. You learned quickly that restraint was not just moral, it was strategic. Between wars, life settled into routines that historians often overlook. You oversaw land, you collected rents, you resolved disputes between tenants. Most conflicts involved boundaries, livestock, unpaid obligations. Violence was the last resort, not the first. This administrative side of knighthood consumed far more time than fighting ever did. Records were kept, witnesses were consulted. Decisions were justified according to custom. A knight who ruled harshly risked rebellion or legal challenge. A knight who ruled weakly invited contempt. Marriage became a duty rather than a romance. Matches were arranged to consolidate land, alliances, or debts. Love was secondary. Children were expected. Sons were raised with the same distant discipline you remembered from your own childhood. Daughters were married strategically. As years passed, the physical cost of training and combat became apparent. Old injuries stiffened, knees ached, grip strength weakened. Armor grew heavier each season, not because it changed, but because you did. There was no retirement. A knight who could no longer fight had to remain useful in other ways or fade quietly into dependency. Some entered religious life. Others managed estates for younger relatives. A few became advisors, their value lying in memory rather than strength. Many simply disappeared from records. This is perhaps the most revealing truth of all. Medieval knighthood was not designed to create heroes. It was designed to produce reliable men who could endure long periods of monotony punctuated by moments of extreme risk. It rewarded patience, obedience, and caution more than daring. The myths that survived the shining armor, the bold charges, the noble quests were shaped after the fact. They smoothed over the waiting, the doubt, the fatigue. They turned a life of obligation into a story of destiny. But if you strip those layers away, what remains is a system built on human endurance. Boys trained slowly into men who learned to wait, to serve, to manage fear and boredom in equal measure. Knighthood was not an escape from ordinary life. It was a more tightly controlled version of it. and in that sense, it was deeply human. As you look back on the long road from page to squire to knight, and forward into a future defined less by choice than by duty, one question lingers quietly beneath the armor. If so much of knighthood was spent waiting, maintaining, and enduring, what does that say about how history remembers power, and how much it forgets about the lives that sustained it? Story 2. Rust, Sweat, and Debt: The Real Cost of Knightly Equipment. When you picture a medieval knight, the armor appears as a given shining, complete, perfectly fitted, as though it emerged fully formed along with the title itself. In reality, armor was never a gift of knighthood. It was a burden you carried long before and long after the ceremony ended. If you were a knight, everything you wore into battle belonged to you, not to your lord, not to the crown, to you, and that single fact shaped your entire life more than any oath ever did. Armor was not issued. It was acquired slowly, piece by piece, over many years. Often it began while you were still a squire. A helmet inherited from a relative, a mail shirt purchased second-hand, greaves that didn't quite fit, altered by a local smith whose skill varied widely. Nothing matched. Nothing was perfect. Perfection was expensive. In the medieval economy of Western Europe, armor represented concentrated wealth. Iron had to be mined, transported, smelted, forged. Leather had to be cured, rivets crafted individually. Each step required labor, fuel, time. Even modest equipment absorbed resources that could otherwise support an entire household. A full suit of mail alone, before plate armor became widespread, could cost the equivalent of several years' income for a skilled worker. Plate armor, when it appeared in later centuries, was even worse. Knights rarely purchased full sets outright. They went into debt. They mortgaged land. They delayed marriage. They borrowed from relatives who expected repayment in influence rather than coin. Every piece of armor carried a history of obligation. Maintenance never stopped. Iron rusted constantly. Moisture was unavoidable. Sweat soaked into padding and leather linings, creating rot and odor that no amount of airing fully removed. After every use, training, travel, even ceremonial wear, armor had to be cleaned, dried, inspected. If you neglected this, the consequences were immediate and visible. Mail links snapped, plates warped, straps tore under stress. A failure in armor was not merely inconvenient, it was lethal, and if it happened, blame fell squarely on you. Equipment failure was seen as negligence, not misfortune. Knights became obsessive about their gear. They learned the sound healthy armor made when struck. They noticed subtle changes in weight, in balance. Armor was not passive protection. It was an extension of the body, and it demanded attention like a living thing. Helmets were particularly personal. Ill-fitting helmets restricted vision or breathing. Padding had to be adjusted carefully. Too loose and it shifted on impact. Too tight and it caused headaches, dizziness, or panic. Many knights modified their helmets repeatedly over years, chasing a balance that was never quite stable. Then there was the horse. A knight without a horse was not a knight in any meaningful sense. War horses' destriers were not simply larger riding animals. They were trained, aggressive, and expensive. Feeding one required significant land. Losing one could ruin you financially. Horses also needed armor. Barding was costly and heavy, often more expensive than the knight's own protection. Many knights went without it, accepting the risk. A wounded horse could end a campaign instantly. Every decision became a calculation. How much armor could you afford? How much weight could your horse carry? How much risk was acceptable? This constant accounting followed you everywhere. Travel exposed armor to damage. Rain seeped into seams. Roads shook fittings loose. Inns rarely had space to store equipment properly, so armor slept beside you, wrapped in cloth that barely helped. You learned to listen for unusual sounds at night, not just for thieves, but for the quiet creak of stressed leather. Theft was common. Armor could be sold, melted down, reused. Losing a single piece might force you to fight with mismatched protection or withdraw entirely. There was no replacement system. There was only improvisation. Armor also shaped how you moved through the world socially. It marked you as wealthy but also as vulnerable. Peasants saw value. Rivals saw opportunity. You were respected but also watched. Even in peacetime, you wore armor selectively. Full equipment was exhausting. Most knights wore partial protection for daily duties, mail shirts without helmets, or padded garments alone. The image of a knight constantly encased in steel is a later invention. Reality required compromise. Debt lingered beneath everything. Armor had to be replaced as styles changed and threats evolved. New weapons demanded new defenses. Falling behind technologically was dangerous, but keeping up meant spending money you often didn't have. Some knights turned to tournaments to recoup costs. These were not harmless games. Injury was common, equipment broke, but prizes and ransoms offered rare chances to recover losses. For many, tournaments were economic necessities disguised as sport. Others relied on patronage. Serving a powerful lord might bring gifts, better armor, a horse, repairs covered quietly. But patronage came with strings. Loyalty became less abstract when your survival depended on another man's generosity. The psychological weight of all this was constant. Armor was supposed to make you feel safe. Instead, it reminded you of how fragile your position was. A broken strap, a missed payment, a sick horse, any of these could undo years of careful management. And yet you continued. You cleaned rust in silence. You counted coins late at night. You weighed risks before every campaign. The armor you wore into battle represented not just protection, but accumulated sacrifice, your own, and that of everyone who supported you. This raises a quiet, unsettling question that medieval writers rarely addressed directly. If knighthood depended so heavily on personal wealth and constant maintenance, how much of medieval warfare was decided not by courage or skill, but by who could afford to keep their armor intact just a little longer? Once armor was acquired and maintained, it still had to be worn. This seems obvious, but the act of wearing armor day after day, mile after mile, was itself a test of endurance and judgment. Armor did not simply protect you. It shaped how you moved, how long you could fight, and how you were perceived by everyone around you. Putting on armor was not quick. Even a relatively simple kit of mail and padding required assistance. Straps had to be tightened in the correct order. Weight had to be distributed carefully. A mistake made in haste could go unnoticed until it caused pain or failure hours later. This is why squires remained essential long after knighthood. Independence was a myth. Support was survival. Once armored, your world narrowed. Vision through a helmet was limited. Hearing was muffled. Breathing required conscious effort, especially in heat. You learned to conserve energy, to move deliberately. Sudden motions wasted strength. Panic wasted air. Marching in armor was particularly exhausting. Contrary to popular images, knights did not usually ride everywhere in full gear. Horses tired. Roads were poor. Much of travel was done on foot, armor packed or partially worn. When full armor was required, progress slowed dramatically. A day's march could feel endless. Heat was one of the greatest enemies. Summer campaigns were brutal. Metal absorbed sunlight. Sweat pooled beneath layers of cloth and padding. Dehydration was common. Heat exhaustion killed more men than enemy blades in some campaigns. Removing armor during breaks was risky. Redonning it took time, and surprise attacks were always possible. Cold brought different problems. Metal numbed the body. Fingers lost dexterity. Buckles became difficult to manage. Frozen leather cracked. Armor stored overnight could be painfully cold to the touch by morning. You learned to endure discomfort without reacting, because reaction wasted time and attention. Armor also affected how you fought psychologically. Knowing how much you had invested financially and socially in your equipment changed your behavior. You avoided unnecessary risks. You protected your body not only for survival, but to protect your investment. Recklessness was expensive. This is one reason why medieval combat often looked cautious. Knights advanced deliberately. They held formation. They waited for advantage. The image of constant wild charges comes largely from later storytelling, not from the realities of armored warfare. Armor marked you visually in unmistakable ways. It announced your status long before you spoke. On the battlefield, this made you a target. Enemy forces recognized armored men as valuable. Capturing a knight could bring ransom. Killing one brought nothing but risk. As a result, armor both protected and endangered you. It reduced the likelihood of death from minor blows, but increased the likelihood that multiple enemies would focus on you at once. Being knocked down was especially dangerous. Weight that protected you standing could trap you on the ground. Training addressed this fear directly. Knights practiced rising quickly from falls, rolling despite weight, using leverage rather than strength. Still, many died not from wounds, but from suffocation, trampling, or exhaustion after being pinned. The design of armor varied by region and tradition. In places like Milan, armorers became famous for high-quality plate that balanced protection and mobility. Their work was exported widely, but at high cost. Only the wealthiest knights could afford it. Others relied on local production. Quality varied dramatically. Some armor looked impressive but failed under stress. Some was patched and repatched, layers added unevenly over time. This patchwork reflected a knight's career, each repair marking survival. Weapons evolved in response to armor, and armor evolved in response to weapons. This arms race drove costs higher. Blunt weapons, polearms, and specialized armor-piercing tools appeared. Armor thickened. Weight increased. Horses bore more burden. Everything became heavier. This cycle trapped many knights financially. To remain effective, they had to invest continually. Falling behind meant increased risk of injury or death, but investing meant debt. Some knights spent their entire lives trying to catch up with technological change. Armor also shaped social interactions off the battlefield. Wearing it into towns commanded respect but also resentment. Peasants saw wealth made visible. Merchants saw customers or thieves. Wearing armor signaled authority but also obligation. You were expected to act when trouble arose. In legal disputes, armor could intimidate witnesses. In negotiations, it could escalate tension. Many knights learned to appear unarmored when diplomacy was required, choosing softer garments to project restraint. Clothing became another calculation. Religious attitudes toward armor were complex. The church blessed weapons and armor, but also warned against pride. Knights were reminded that armor could not protect the soul. This message was repeated often, perhaps because it needed repeating. When survival depended so much on material objects, humility required effort. Damage accumulated quietly. Dents remained. Cracks spread. Armor that had saved you once might fail next time. Every mark told a story you remembered clearly: an arrow deflected, a blow absorbed, a moment when things nearly ended. These memories attached you emotionally to your equipment. Armor was not interchangeable. Losing it felt personal. Some knights named their swords not out of romance, but because those objects had shared danger with them. As years passed, wearing armor became harder. Bodies aged. Old injuries flared under weight. What had once felt manageable became exhausting, yet expectation did not change. A knight was expected to appear ready, regardless of cost. This leads to a quiet contradiction at the heart of knighthood. Armor symbolized strength and stability, yet it constantly reminded you of vulnerability: financial, physical, and social. It protected you, but it also bound you to a cycle of maintenance and risk that never truly ended. And so, as you fastened straps before another march, feeling the familiar weight settle onto your shoulders, a question lingers beneath the metal. How long can a system built on such personal expense and constant strain sustain the men it depends on? There came a point in many knights' lives when armor no longer felt like protection. It felt like exposure. This was not because armor suddenly failed to stop weapons, though sometimes it did, but because the conditions surrounding warfare changed faster than individual men could adapt. Armor, once a symbol of stability and preparedness, became a marker of how trapped a knight was inside an expensive system that demanded constant renewal. By the late medieval period, warfare had begun to shift. Larger armies formed. Infantry tactics improved. Weapons designed specifically to counter armor became more common. Pikes, bills, maces, and later firearms altered the balance that knights had spent generations maintaining. For the individual knight, this was not an abstract transformation. It was felt physically. Blows that once glanced off now landed with bone-crushing force. A mace did not need to pierce armor to kill. It only needed to transfer enough energy. Armor still protected against cuts, but it could not fully protect against impact. To compensate, armor grew thicker. Thicker armor meant more weight. More weight meant slower movement, greater fatigue, and increased dependence on horses that were themselves strained by heavier loads. Horses collapsed more often. When they fell, knights fell with them, and rising became harder each year. This escalation fed directly into debt. Armorers charged more for thicker plate. Repairs took longer. Transport costs increased. Knights found themselves locked into a cycle where survival required spending more money just to maintain the same level of effectiveness they once had with less. Those who could not keep up adapted in other ways. Some avoided battle when possible. Others fought on foot more often, despite the risk. Some aligned themselves closely with wealthy patrons, trading independence for security. A growing number simply failed. Records from conflicts like the 100 Years' War show increasing numbers of knights captured not because they fought poorly, but because their equipment limited their ability to retreat, maneuver, or respond to unexpected tactics. Armor that had once made them elite now made them predictable. The social meaning of armor shifted as well. What had once symbolized readiness and honor increasingly symbolized wealth alone. Mercenary soldiers, equipped with cheaper but effective weapons, began to outperform heavily armored men in certain conditions. This created resentment and anxiety among knights who had invested their lives and fortunes into a model of warfare that no longer guaranteed superiority. Yet abandoning armor was not an option. Without it, a knight lost identity. Authority was visually reinforced through equipment. Arriving unarmored signaled weakness, even if tactically sensible. Appearances mattered deeply in medieval society. To appear diminished was to invite challenge. This pressure kept knights wearing armor even when it no longer served them well. The physical toll accumulated. Chronic pain became normal. Knees worn from years of mounting and dismounting under weight. Backs strained from imbalance. Hands stiff from gripping weapons through padded gloves that reduced sensation. These injuries rarely healed. They were managed, ignored, or endured. There was no concept of long-term care. A knight injured beyond usefulness was not rehabilitated. He was replaced. Some attempted to transition into less physically demanding roles. They managed estates, advised lords, supervised troops. But these positions were limited. They depended on connections and reputation. A knight who lacked both found himself increasingly irrelevant. Armor, meanwhile, continued to decay. Metal fatigued over time. Microscopic cracks spread. Repairs masked weaknesses rather than eliminating them. Many knights entered later battles wearing armor that looked solid but was structurally compromised. They knew this. They had felt it flex differently, sound duller under testing blows, but replacement was too costly. This knowledge produced a particular kind of fear, not the sudden terror of combat, but a slow, persistent awareness that protection had limits. Knights learned to fight with this awareness present, adjusting posture, guarding favored sides, compensating unconsciously for weaknesses they could not afford to fix. Death, when it came, was often quiet and unremarkable. A fall, a crushing blow, suffocation beneath bodies. The armor remained intact. The man inside did not. Afterward, equipment was stripped, sold, reused. Armor outlived its owners. It passed through many hands, accumulating dents and repairs, until it no longer resembled its original form. In this way, armor became a silent archive of forgotten lives. What history books often miss is how many knights reached the end of their lives without resolution. No heroic final stand. No dramatic recognition. Just a gradual narrowing of options, constrained by debt, injury, and obligation. Armor, which had once promised safety and status, ended as a reminder of how little room there was to change course. And yet, knights continued to invest in it, not because it always worked, but because it was the only system they knew. Knighthood was built on visible commitment. Armor was proof that you still belonged, even if belonging came at the cost of comfort, security, and eventually relevance. In this sense, medieval armor tells a story not of triumph, but of endurance, of men who carried extraordinary weight financially and physically, not because it guaranteed success, but because abandoning it meant losing everything they were. As the medieval world moved slowly toward new forms of warfare and authority, armor remained behind, heavy with tradition, binding its wearers to a past that no longer fully protected them. And this leaves one final, lingering question. If the symbols of power can outlast their usefulness, how often does history mistake endurance for dominance? And what does it fail to see about the cost paid by those who keep wearing the armor anyway? Story 3. More paperwork than swordplay. Knights as land managers and bureaucrats. When you imagine a medieval knight at work, it is almost never with a pen in hand. And yet, for most knights, writing, counting, listening, and deciding consumed far more hours than fighting ever did. The sword may have defined their social identity, but paperwork, slow, repetitive, and deeply consequential, defined their daily authority. Once you became a knight, especially one tied to land, you entered a world governed by obligation rather than adventure. Land was not just property, it was responsibility. Fields had to be measured. Tenants had to be recorded. Rents had to be collected on time, in the correct form, and according to custom. Failure to manage these details did not result in mild inconvenience. It resulted in unrest. Most knights did not own vast estates. They managed small, fragmented holdings, scattered fields, villages, mills, and rights passed down unevenly through generations. Boundaries were often unclear. Records were incomplete. Memory mattered as much as documentation. You learned quickly that authority depended on consistency. Disputes were constant. A tenant claimed his father had always grazed sheep on a particular strip of land. A neighboring lord insisted that a boundary marker had been moved. A miller accused villagers of avoiding fees. None of these issues could be solved by force alone without risking escalation. Violence was expensive. Retaliation lingered. So you listened. Knights spent long days hearing grievances. Many were trivial, some were deeply personal. All required attention. You had to appear fair, even when enforcing decisions that benefited you directly. Reputation mattered more than speed. A knight known for arbitrary rulings invited resistance. A knight known for predictability maintained order. This work required patience more than intelligence. In regions shaped strongly by feudal custom, such as England, local courts were routine. Knights presided over manorial courts where fines were assessed, obligations confirmed, and disputes recorded. These courts met regularly, often monthly. Attendance was expected. Absence was noticed. Records from these courts survive in surprising detail. They show knights concerned with fences, paths, livestock, brewing rights, marriage permissions, and inheritance disputes. Rarely do they mention warfare. When they do, it is usually in the context of absent tenants excused from duties because their lord was away on campaign. Paperwork, when available, was precious. Parchment was expensive. Literacy varied. Many knights could read, fewer could write fluently. Clerks were employed when possible. Where they were not, memory and witnesses filled the gap. This made consistency critical. Contradicting yourself publicly damaged authority. The rhythm of the year shaped everything. Agricultural cycles dictated income. Poor harvests reduced rents. Bad weather delayed obligations. Knights had to balance enforcement with survival. Pressing too hard risked starvation or flight. Pressing too lightly risked insolvency. This balancing act was constant. Knights were also responsible for infrastructure. Roads needed maintenance. Bridges collapsed. Mills required repair. These projects demanded coordination, materials, and labor. They were slow, unglamorous tasks that produced little visible reward until they failed. Failure was public. A broken mill disrupted food supply. A collapsed bridge hindered trade. In such cases, blame traveled upward. Authority flowed down. Responsibility flowed up. Knights learned that competence mattered more than charisma. Correspondence increased as administrative systems expanded. Letters arrived bearing requests, demands, confirmations. They required responses. Delays could be interpreted as disrespect. Poor wording could escalate tension. Knights learned to be careful with language, even if they relied on scribes to compose it. All of this work took place against the background of legal complexity. Custom varied by region, by village, sometimes by family. What was acceptable in one place was forbidden in another. Knights became local experts in tradition. They were expected to know how things had always been done, even when that memory was contested. This is where boredom entered deeply into knightly life. Days passed without incident. Weeks blurred together. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was success. Stability was the goal. Excitement often meant failure somewhere else. Young knights, especially those raised on stories of valor, found this transition difficult. The skills required listening, negotiating, remembering were not those celebrated in song. Yet they were the skills that kept households intact. Some knights delegated eagerly. Others involved themselves obsessively. Both approaches carried risk. Delegation invited corruption. Over-involvement invited resentment. Finding balance took years. War disrupted this routine, but it did not replace it. When knights left on campaign, their administrative duties did not disappear. They were handled by stewards, spouses, or relatives. Upon return, accounts had to be reviewed. Decisions had to be confirmed or reversed. Authority had to be reasserted carefully. This reassertion was delicate. Absence weakened control. Knights learned to reestablish presence slowly, attending courts, confirming rights, addressing grievances. Heavy-handed returns often sparked conflict. The quiet truth is that many knights measured their success not by victories, but by continuity. Did the land remain productive? Did tenants remain loyal? Did disputes resolve without violence? These were the real tests of knighthood. And yet, history rarely lingers here. Administrative competence leaves few dramatic traces. No songs celebrate a well-maintained boundary. No chronicles praise accurate rent collection. These successes were invisible by design. But without them, nothing else functioned. As you sit through another long court session, listening to familiar arguments, noting details that seem insignificant, you may find yourself wondering, if this quiet labor sustained medieval power far more reliably than combat ever did, why has history remembered the sword and forgotten the pen? Once you accepted that authority rested less on force than on consistency, your role as a knight changed in ways few stories acknowledge. You were no longer defined by what you could do in moments of danger, but by what you could endure during long stretches of normality. Governance, in the medieval sense, was not about innovation. It was about repetition. Each season brought the same obligations. In spring, you confirmed plowing rights and seed arrangements. In summer, disputes over grazing intensified. In autumn, rents were due, often paid not in coin but in grain, labor, or livestock. In winter, complaints accumulated about shortages, debts, broken tools, unresolved grievances. The cycle repeated with little variation. You learned that authority depended on memory, remembering who owed what, remembering which exception you granted last year and why. Forgetting created openings. Tenants tested boundaries quietly, not out of malice but out of necessity. Survival encouraged negotiation. Your presence mattered more than your decisions. A knight who appeared regularly, who walked boundaries, inspected fields, attended courts, maintained order without force. Absence bred rumor. Rumor bred defiance. You could feel this shift before it became visible, in tone rather than action. Language became one of your primary tools. You learned how to phrase decisions so they sounded inevitable rather than imposed. You referenced custom often. "This is how it has always been done," carried more weight than any threat. Even when custom was unclear, invoking it suggested continuity. Written records helped, but they were not always decisive. Many villagers could not read, but they remembered. Witnesses mattered. Elders mattered. Knights who ignored communal memory in favor of documents alone often failed. Authority required aligning paper with people. This balance was especially delicate in regions with layered jurisdictions, such as Holy Roman Empire, where overlapping rights and obligations were common. A knight might owe service to multiple lords, each with different expectations. Local customs might conflict with imperial law. Navigating this required diplomacy more than force. Conflict resolution occupied much of your time. Most disputes were small: a fence moved, a path blocked, a debt unpaid. But small disputes could escalate if mishandled. Knights learned to diffuse rather than dominate. Compromise was not weakness, it was efficiency. Punishments were usually minor: fines, temporary loss of rights, public acknowledgement of fault. Severe penalties were rare, not because knights were merciful, but because harshness created long-term problems. A punished tenant still had to work the land. A resentful village was harder to manage than a dissatisfied one. You also learned the limits of your power. Not everything could be enforced. Weather disrupted plans. Disease reduced labor. External demands, taxes, levies, military service strained resources. When higher authorities demanded more than the land could give, you became the buffer. This position was uncomfortable. Tenants blamed you for obligations you did not create. Lords blamed you for shortfalls you could not prevent. You stood in the middle, absorbing frustration from both directions. This emotional labor rarely appears in chronicles, but it shaped decisions constantly. Family played a critical role. Spouses managed estates during absences. Children were introduced early to administrative routines. Household members became informal clerks, messengers, witnesses. Knighthood was not an individual role, it was distributed across a family network. Women, in particular, handled significant administrative responsibility, especially during campaigns or illness. While records often list knights as decision makers, correspondence and court documents reveal wives issuing orders, negotiating rents, and resolving disputes. Authority was more shared than ideology admitted. Over time, you developed a sense of scale. You learned which issues required immediate attention and which could wait. You learned to tolerate minor disorder to preserve larger stability. This judgment separated competent knights from ineffective ones. Boredom was constant, but it was productive boredom. It trained attention to detail. It rewarded patience. Knights who resisted this reality, who sought constant excitement or enforced authority through spectacle, often destabilized their own holdings. War interrupted governance, but it did not replace it. When you left, systems had to continue. Upon return, you assessed damage not just physical but relational. Who felt neglected? Who had overstepped? Corrections were made quietly, incrementally. This slow reassertion of order was itself a skill. What emerges from this administrative life is a different image of knighthood, one defined not by moments of violence, but by long-term management. Power was maintained not through fear, but through predictability. The sword remained present, but mostly as a symbol, rarely as a tool. And so, as you finish another day of hearings, sign off on another set of obligations, and prepare for a future that looks much like the past, a quiet tension remains. If effective governance required such restraint, compromise, and patience, how did the image of the knight become so tightly bound to sudden, decisive violence? By the time you had spent years managing land, resolving disputes, and enforcing custom, the sword had become secondary not because it was unimportant, but because it was rarely the right tool. The authority that lasted was quiet, procedural, and deeply unremarkable to anyone not living under it. This was the kind of power that left few traces. Unlike castles or battles, administration did not announce itself. When it worked well, nothing happened. Fields were planted, rents were paid, paths remained open, villages endured. The absence of crisis became the measure of success, even though no one praised it openly. You learned that most people did not want justice in an abstract sense. They wanted predictability. They wanted to know what would happen if they failed, if they succeeded, if they asked for exception. Knights who delivered predictable outcomes, even harsh ones, were tolerated. Those who surprised their tenants were feared, and fear was unstable. Over time, your role as a knight blurred into something closer to a civil administrator. You knew which families struggled every winter. You knew which disputes resurfaced every generation. You knew which customs mattered emotionally, even when they no longer made economic sense. And you learned when not to intervene. Not every wrong required correction. Not every violation needed punishment. Knights who tried to enforce every rule quickly exhausted goodwill and attention. Selective enforcement, while morally uncomfortable, was often practical. Authority functioned best when it was visible but not constant. This selectivity shaped how power was perceived. Tenants rarely thought of you as heroic or villainous. They thought of you as permanent. You were part of the landscape, like the mill or the road. Complaints were directed at you because you were there, not because you were exceptional. This permanence came at a cost. Administrative authority required emotional distance. You heard grievances daily, many of them rooted in loss, hunger, or fear. You could not absorb them all without becoming paralyzed. So you learned to listen without reacting, to acknowledge without promising, to decide without explaining fully. Over time, this restraint hardened. Knights who governed for decades often became reserved, cautious with words, slow to change. From the outside, this looked like stubbornness. From the inside, it felt like survival. Change disrupted balance. Balance kept peace. Legal systems slowly expanded around this reality. Written records increased. Standardized procedures emerged. Knights became part of larger administrative hierarchies, especially as kingdoms centralized. In places like France, royal officials increasingly overlapped with local authority, narrowing the knight's independence. This transition was gradual and deeply unsettling. Knights were still responsible for outcomes but less free to shape them. Royal law superseded custom. Appeals bypassed local courts. Decisions were reviewed. Authority became conditional rather than assumed. For some knights, this was a relief. Responsibility could be shared. For others, it felt like erosion. The skills they had cultivated, memory, negotiation, personal presence, mattered less in systems that valued documentation and uniformity. Yet even as formal power shifted, informal authority persisted. Villagers still came to you first. They trusted familiarity over distant officials. You mediated before conflicts escalated into legal action. You translated new laws into old habits. This intermediary role became your final form as a knight, not warrior, not ruler, but translator between systems. And when age finally reduced your ability to serve actively, there was no ceremony marking the transition. You simply did less. Others did more. Your name appeared less often in records. Authority moved quietly to the next generation. When you died, your administrative legacy vanished quickly. Boundaries shifted. Customs evolved. Records were replaced. Only unresolved disputes carried your memory forward, usually as a phrase, "In the time of the old lord." This is why knights loom so faintly in the everyday history they shaped. Their most important work was designed to disappear. Stability leaves no monuments. Peace produces no spectacle. And yet without this quiet labor, nothing else endured. Castles fell. Dynasties collapsed. Battles ended. But the routines of land management, dispute resolution, and obligation carried society forward, one unremarkable day at a time. So when history remembers knights primarily as figures of sudden violence and dramatic honor, it misses the deeper truth. Their real power lay not in moments of action, but in years of restraint. Not in what they destroyed, but in what they kept functioning. As you imagine the medieval past, filled with banners and steel, it is worth pausing to consider this final question. If the most influential forms of power leave the fewest traces, how much of history's true work has been done by people and days that were never meant to be remembered? Story 4. Hunger in the Great Hall: What Knights Actually Ate. When you imagine a medieval knight, it is easy to picture a lavish feast. Platters of roasted meats, golden goblets overflowing with wine, the clamor of laughter echoing through a candlelit hall. In reality, the daily diet of knights was far less glamorous and often surprisingly monotonous. Hunger, inconvenience, and scarcity shaped life more than ceremony or indulgence. Most knights did not dine in great halls every day. Only during special occasions, tournaments, or when hosted by wealthier lords did the imagined banquets appear. For the rest of the year, meals were dictated by practicality, availability, storage, and season. Your own household and holdings determined what you ate. Food security was never guaranteed. Bread was the foundation, not the white, soft loaves of storybooks, but coarse, heavy bread made from rye, barley, or mixed grains. It was filling, and for peasants and knights alike, it was cheap. Wealthier knights could afford finer wheat, but even then, bread often came hard or stale after a few days, requiring soaking in broth or ale to be edible. Ale was another constant. Water sources were unreliable and frequently contaminated, so ale or small beer was a safer choice. It was consumed at every meal not for pleasure, but for hydration and nutrition. Alcohol content was low, but its caloric contribution was significant. Knights became accustomed to the sour, bitter taste of ale as an everyday staple. Meat was not guaranteed. While you were trained and equipped for war, you did not automatically have access to protein. Hunting rights were restricted. Market prices fluctuated. Even when meat was available, it was often preserved salted, dried, or smoked to last longer, sacrificing flavor for survival. Fresh meat was a treat, not a norm. Vegetables, legumes, and grains provided sustenance. Peas, beans, onions, cabbage, and leeks filled much of the diet, often boiled into thick, bland stews. Spices were expensive and rare. Salt was more common, but even then its use depended on local supply. Flavor was functional, not aesthetic. Knights did not eat alone. Meals reinforced hierarchy. Servants and squires ate first in the kitchen or hall, while the knight might wait until food was prepared and portions confirmed. Discipline and timing mattered. Hunger was not unusual, especially during long campaigns or busy administrative seasons. Stoicism was expected. Campaigns intensified scarcity. Armies on the move carried limited supplies. Knights often relied on what could be foraged, requisitioned, or rationed. Fresh meat was a luxury. Bread hardened into durable blocks. Ale became thinner and watered down. Vegetables were whatever could be scavenged. Hunger shaped decisions: when to move, when to fight, when to negotiate for provisions. You learned to value efficiency in eating. Meals were quick, functional, and sometimes repeated daily without variation. Your body adapted to monotony. Appetite persisted, but indulgence was a risk. Overeating slowed movement, increased fatigue, and wasted precious resources. Preservation methods defined life. Salting, smoking, and drying extended food availability, but required planning. Knights and their households stored grains in bulk, cured meats over months, and relied on root vegetables that could be kept through winter. Improper storage invited spoilage, illness, or waste luxuries no one could afford. The social aspect of dining was important but subtle. Meals reinforced bonds among household members. Squiring relationships continued at the table. Servants, advisors, and family all consumed from the same sources, observing manners, etiquette, and hierarchy. Eating poorly or too well could signal status, competence, or arrogance. Nutrition often fell short. Hard work, long marches, training, and campaigns demanded calories far beyond what ordinary meals provided. Knights supplemented their intake with hunting, small game, and foraging when possible. Illness from inadequate diet was common. Fatigue affected performance, judgment, and endurance. Luxury was rare and controlled. Spices, sugar, preserved fruits, imported wines all were symbols of status. Access depended on wealth, location, and political favor. Many knights went years without these items. When present, they were consumed sparingly, sometimes ceremonially, rather than for enjoyment. Monotony shaped appetite. By the time campaigns, courtly duties, or estate management consumed most of your life, you learned to endure repetitive meals with little complaint. Patience, long cultivated during training, applied to sustenance as well. Food became fuel rather than pleasure, a functional component of survival. Even feasts, when they occurred, were less satisfying than imagined. They were carefully staged to display wealth, power, and obligation rather than to meet hunger. Portions could be smaller than assumed. Rituals were rigid. Entertainment competed with food. Discipline persisted, even when indulgence seemed allowed. This controlled, often austere, approach to eating had consequences. Knights learned to appreciate rationing, anticipate scarcity, and value every calorie. They developed habits that balanced survival, social expectation, and resource management. Hunger was not just physical, it shaped judgment, priorities, and strategy. And yet, despite all this preparation, deprivation remained unpredictable. Crop failures, long campaigns, or political disruption could reduce meals to near survival levels. Knights, accustomed to structured life, faced hunger as both nuisance and threat. Managing it was a quiet, constant part of existence, far from the heroism chronicled in stories. So, as you imagine knights feasting under chandeliers or riding into battle with bread and ale in hand, remember this: their daily lives were structured by scarcity and monotony. Meals were endurance tests, moments of social ritual, and exercises in management. They trained not only for combat but for survival in a world where hunger could arrive silently and without warning. And this raises an open-ended thought. If knights were so disciplined in armor and weaponry, how did the quiet, relentless challenge of daily sustenance shape their character, decisions, and the unfolding of medieval history itself? The challenge of eating increased dramatically once you left home. Campaigns, sieges, and long marches exposed the limits of both supply and imagination. Knights who were trained to fight, ride, and endure weighty armor now faced a different kind of endurance, feeding themselves and their retinues while on the move. Armies carried limited provisions. Grain and salted meat were staples because they traveled well and lasted longer than fresh food. Horses consumed far more than knights, and their fodder had to be prioritized. Often, if supplies ran short, the knight's own diet was sacrificed first. You learned early that your horse could not survive on scraps alone, and that losing your mount was more disastrous than missing a single meal. Field kitchens were rudimentary. A campfire, a cauldron, a few rough utensils. Meals were improvised, often just bulk porridge or watery stew. Flavor was secondary to caloric content and ease of preparation. Spices or delicacies were nearly impossible to transport. Herbs might be gathered locally, but they were rare and inconsistent. The art of foraging became essential. Knights, their squires, and servants searched forests, fields, and villages for edible plants, small game, or fish. Berries, nuts, mushrooms, and roots supplemented rations. Hunting deer, rabbits, or birds required skill and patience, but even a modest catch could feed a small household for a day. This work was laborious, uncertain, and often dangerous, as forests could conceal both wild animals and hostile locals. Feasting on campaigns was a rare occurrence. Victories or strategic captures might provide plunder, a herd of pigs, barrels of grain, or even a stored wine shipment. These events were celebrated, but they were exceptions, not rules. More often, hunger was managed through rationing and ingenuity. Water was another concern. Rivers, wells, or rainwater were the only sources. Contamination caused illness frequently. Knights relied on ale or beer when available, but brewing capacity was limited on campaign. Drinking water from unknown sources required calculation. Risking dysentery was common, but sometimes unavoidable. Meals reinforced hierarchy even in hardship. Knights ate first, followed by squires, retainers, and laborers. Portions were carefully measured to maintain morale and demonstrate status. Eating out of turn, consuming more than your share, or neglecting protocols could invite punishment or social friction, even in dire circumstances. Preservation remained a constant concern. Meat had to be salted or smoked. Bread hardened into durable blocks. Vegetables were boiled into thick stews that could last several meals. Spoilage was not just unpleasant, it threatened survival. Rotten food could decimate a unit faster than combat. The monotony of campaign meals affected morale. Soldiers complained quietly, fatigue grew faster, and knights had to manage both logistics and temperament. A poorly fed retinue could become uncooperative or mutinous. Hunger was a strategic factor, shaping movements, decisions, and timing of engagements. Even in sieges, the struggle was stark. Supply lines were cut. Food had to be rationed. Knights relied on stored provisions, captured livestock, or the generosity or coercion of surrounding villages. Siege diets were minimal: coarse bread, salted meat, and limited vegetables. Starvation became a weapon, and survival depended on planning and patience. Knights learned to eat efficiently. Meals were functional, not leisurely. Chewing was deliberate to maximize caloric intake. Liquids accompanied solids for hydration and digestion. Eating became a strategy of survival. Time spent eating was time not moving, fighting, or supervising. Efficiency saved energy and reduced vulnerability. Monotony and scarcity had psychological effects. Hunger sharpened awareness. Decisions about rationing, distribution, and foraging became daily exercises in leadership. A well-fed retinue functioned effectively. A hungry one fractured. Knights developed an intimate understanding of the relationship between food, morale, and control. Food also reinforced social bonds. Shared hardship created loyalty. Providing rations equitably demonstrated competence and fairness. Conversely, favoritism or waste undermined authority. Even in simple porridge or salted meat, meals communicated hierarchy, expectation, and trust. Seasonality added complexity. Campaigns in winter demanded different strategies than spring or summer. Foraging was limited. Stored provisions became essential. Rivers froze. Horses struggled to find fodder. Knights adapted by stockpiling, rationing, or improvising substitutes. Nutrition remained imperfect. Protein was sporadic, vegetables minimal, and calories often insufficient for energy-intensive work. Malnourishment weakened bodies, slowed reaction times, and increased susceptibility to illness. Knights learned to compensate through packing, discipline, and conservation of energy. Despite scarcity, meals were not ignored. Rituals persisted even in the field. Grace might be said. Portions were distributed ceremonially. Even small gestures, sharing a rare piece of meat, passing a favored utensil, or allowing a squire extra ration, reinforced loyalty and social cohesion. Survival depended not just on calories, but on maintaining the social fabric of the unit. And yet, for all the preparation, starvation remained a threat. Knights were trained to endure hunger, just as they were trained to endure cold, fatigue, and monotony. The difference was subtle. Physical hunger demanded vigilance, but psychological hunger, the anxiety of uncertainty, required as much strategy and resilience as combat. In the end, food on campaign shaped knights more than many battles did. Hunger tested patience, leadership, resourcefulness, and foresight. It revealed weaknesses, rewarded planning, and punished mismanagement. Meals were never merely nourishment, they were instruments of survival, morale, and authority. And this leads to a reflective question. If knights were shaped as much by scarcity and endurance as by training and combat, how much of medieval history was influenced not by swords, but by what people had or didn't have to eat? The reality of a knight's diet reveals a side of medieval life rarely discussed in chronicles, songs, or popular imagination. Knights were often assumed to be always well-fed, indulging in banquet halls with lavish spreads. In truth, hunger and scarcity were constant companions shaping decision-making, strategy, and even the exercise of authority. Even after campaigns ended and knights returned home, food remained a matter of careful management rather than abundance. Storage was never perfect. Grains could spoil, meat could rot, and preserved vegetables lost nutritional value over time. Knights oversaw these resources carefully, inspecting stores, rationing for the household, and adjusting for the unpredictability of seasons. Hunger influenced daily life profoundly. A poorly fed knight became sluggish in training, less attentive during court sessions, and slower to respond in combat. Fatigue from insufficient calories could compound the monotony and stress of land management. Maintaining alertness required not just mental discipline, but constant attention to what and how much you ate. Mealtimes became rituals of efficiency. Bread and ale were eaten steadily to maintain energy. Porridges, stews, and preserved foods were consumed for consistency, not pleasure. Rare indulgences, fresh meat, imported spices, sweet pastries were treasured and often shared strategically. They were rewards, both for yourself and for retainers, serving as tools to reinforce loyalty. Campaigns made hunger more urgent and visible. The unpredictability of travel, weather, and supply forced knights to calculate every meal. They learned the value of rationing and the cost of improvisation. Even a single misjudgment could weaken a retinue, threaten morale, or cause outright failure. Knights often carried contingency rations, but these were insufficient for prolonged shortages. Hunger was a constant, unglamorous adversary. Interestingly, scarcity also shaped innovation. Knights experimented with preservation techniques, smoking meat longer, fermenting vegetables, and developing portable rations for travel. They adapted local knowledge from peasants and fellow soldiers. Simple survival demanded ingenuity. The same patience and discipline taught in training drills now applied to food, demonstrating that sustenance was as strategic as any weapon. Social dynamics around meals were equally important. The distribution of food in the household and on campaign reflected hierarchy and obligation. Knights ensured that squires, servants, and retainers received enough to function, even if their own rations were limited. This reinforced loyalty and underscored authority. Mismanagement, however small, could fracture trust. Hungry soldiers were dangerous soldiers, and hungry retainers could become unruly. Food scarcity also underscored broader social realities. Nobility and knights depended on the productivity and cooperation of the lower classes to secure provisions. Crop failure, theft, or delayed labor could ripple through an estate or army. Knights quickly learned that leadership required understanding the rhythms of agricultural life and anticipating shortages before they became crises. Beyond the physical and social impact, the experience of hunger had a psychological effect. Patience became a constant necessity. Knights learned to endure discomfort without complaint, to ration effort as well as calories, and to accept that circumstances, whether war, politics, often dictated outcomes beyond personal control. This endurance shaped personality and decision-making, cultivating the kind of resilience essential to survival in the unpredictable medieval world. Even great feasts were colored by this awareness. While songs romanticized lavish spreads, in reality, celebrations were tightly controlled. Portions were distributed according to status. Guests were reminded of hierarchy through seating arrangements, timing of dishes, and ceremonial attention to protocol. Food, while occasionally pleasurable, was a tool of social control as much as sustenance. The harshest lesson was that indulgence was temporary and fragile. Victories could yield spoils, a generous lord could host a banquet, and seasonal abundance might bring treats, but scarcity always returned. Knights who overindulged or failed to plan for scarcity risked weakness, illness, or loss of authority. Survival depended on balance, foresight, and discipline, the same qualities cultivated in training and campaigns. Over years, this diet, monotonous, rationed, carefully measured, shaped the character of knights as profoundly as any sword. They learned the limits of physical endurance, the necessity of planning, and the interplay between human desire and environmental constraint. Meals were not distractions. They were instruments that trained judgment, patience, and leadership. By the time a knight reached the end of his service, hunger had become familiar, not a threat, but a teacher. It instilled an appreciation for order, discipline, and foresight. Knights who survived long campaigns and years of administration carried these lessons with them, applying the same endurance and judgment to governance, combat, and estate management. And yet, history rarely remembers this side of knighthood. Chronicles praise victories, battles, and heroic deeds. Songs celebrate feasts and extravagant ceremonies. The quiet, persistent influence of hunger, the shaping of character, strategy, and endurance, remains invisible. As you consider the life of a medieval knight, one question lingers. If the challenges of daily survival, hunger, monotony, scarcity shaped decisions, strategy, and character more than isolated battles, how much of history's course was quietly determined at the table rather than on the battlefield? Story 5. The hidden wounds, disease, infection, and the unseen battles of knights. When we imagine knights, the mind conjures visions of clashing swords, galloping horses, and heroic combat. But for every knight who fell in a dramatic battle, countless others were felled by enemies invisible to the eye: disease, infection, and the slow erosion of health. These hidden wounds shaped the lives, effectiveness, and survival of knights as profoundly as any army or weapon. Even before they donned armor, knights were exposed to threats of illness. Childhood diseases were common, from smallpox to measles, often leaving survivors weakened or scarred. Training as a squire demanded physical rigor, but also close contact with others in crowded halls, stables, and communal living spaces. Germs traveled silently. A seemingly minor fever could become life-threatening. Diet influenced vulnerability. Bread, ale, and occasional protein provided calories, but nutritional gaps were significant. Lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant deficiencies in vitamins and minerals. Knights developed resilience to some conditions through adaptation, but others, scurvy, anemia, or gastrointestinal disturbances, compromised endurance and recovery. Camp life exacerbated risk. When knights went on campaign, sanitation was minimal. Latrines were crude or absent. Waste mingled with drinking water. Fleas, lice, and other parasites thrived. Close quarters and shared bedding allowed infections to spread rapidly. One sick night could infect dozens of retainers, and illness could incapacitate an entire company without a single sword being drawn. Wounds acquired in training or battle carried their own hazards. Even minor cuts could fester. Armor, while protective, was rarely sterile. Blades nicked the skin. Splinters from wooden shields or equipment could pierce flesh. The medieval understanding of infection was rudimentary. Boiling water, clean cloths, and herbs helped, but bacteria were invisible and unstoppable. Simple wounds sometimes became fatal. Surgeons, when available, offered limited remedies. Knowledge of anatomy was basic. Bloodletting, poultices, and cauterization were standard. Some methods caused more harm than healing. Sutures, when applied, were often contaminated. Many knights endured repeated infections that modern medicine would easily treat. Chronic illness was a hidden aspect of knightly life. Old injuries, sprains, fractures, and joint damage compounded with age and continuous strain. Armor, while protective, contributed to wear. Knees, hips, and backs suffered. Persistent pain and reduced mobility affected not only combat ability but daily administrative work. Plagues and epidemics added layers of threat. Local outbreaks could decimate villages and retainers, leaving knights without support. Larger pandemics, like periodic waves of plague in Europe, struck indiscriminately. Being wealthy or armored offered no protection. Social disruption compounded mortality. Estates struggled to function. Armies weakened. Supply lines failed. Psychological impact accompanied physical illness. Fear of contagion, loss of comrades, and uncertainty about survival shaped decisions. Campaigns were delayed or abandoned due to sickness. Knights learned to weigh not only the enemy's strength, but also the health of their forces and themselves. Planning included considerations for the unpredictable nature of disease, a factor rarely romanticized in stories. Hygiene was minimal but not absent. Bathing occurred but sparingly. Clothes were changed when possible, though laundering was difficult and infrequent. Sweat and grime accumulated beneath armor, creating ideal conditions for bacterial and fungal infections. Skin irritations, boils, and ulcers were common, often lingering and worsening over time. Travel further increased risk. Roads were rough, inns crowded, and exposure to weather prolonged. Frostbite in winter, heat stroke in summer, and waterborne illnesses in rivers and streams were constant threats. Knights carried knowledge, instinct, and caution, but not immunity. Vaccines did not exist. Remedies relied on herbal knowledge, superstition, and trial and error. A single infection could force retreat, remove a knight from service, or even end life. Battles were not always lost to the enemy, but to invisible pathogens that struck silently. Some knights survived years of campaigns only to be undone by minor illnesses at home. Simple colds, gastrointestinal upset, or infected wounds could escalate. Medical understanding was insufficient to prevent these outcomes, and social structures provided no safety net for those incapacitated. Financial ruin could follow prolonged illness, as estates could not function without oversight, and debts continued to accrue. The hidden impact of disease shaped strategy as much as battlefield tactics. Sieges required long-term planning not only for provisions but also for sanitation. Camp arrangements considered exposure, water sources, and isolation of the sick when possible. Successful commanders, including knights in leadership, understood the deadly potential of disease, often more so than that of opposing armies. Even when survival was possible, illness left lasting consequences. Weakness, chronic pain, impaired mobility, and reduced stamina limited effectiveness in both combat and administration. Knights learned to compensate, relying on skill, support networks, and forethought. Physical resilience mattered, but so did observation, patience, and planning, qualities that sometimes mattered more than courage. And here is the quiet paradox. The very measures designed to protect knights' armor, strategic planning and disciplined routines were powerless against these invisible threats. Swords and strategy could not ward off infection, and surviving required endurance, attention to detail, and sometimes sheer luck. As you consider the life of a knight, it is worth reflecting. If invisible enemies such as disease shaped survival more than any sword, how much of history's outcomes depended not on bravery in battle, but on endurance, hygiene, and luck against threats too small to see? Once knights were in the field, disease became an omnipresent hazard, often more dangerous than the enemy standing across the battlefield. The very conditions that allowed medieval armies to operate crowded camps, shared tents, poor sanitation, and limited food created ideal environments for illness to thrive. A minor infection could incapacitate a soldier within days, while a full-blown outbreak could decimate entire units. Consider wounds first. Even minor scratches from training or combat could become life-threatening. Armor protected against slashing blows, but not against blunt trauma, splinters, or pins that caused skin tears. These injuries often went untreated until infection had set in. Knights understood that pus, fever, or swelling could mean death if not managed, yet effective treatment was largely guesswork. Herbal poultices, vinegar washes, and cauterization were common, but often insufficient. Campaign life magnified these dangers. Soldiers shared communal water sources, food preparation was rudimentary, and camp hygiene was minimal. Latrines were shallow pits dug near sleeping areas. Flies and vermin spread disease silently. Knights, despite their training and social rank, were not immune. Lice, scabies, and parasites thrived under padded armor, while fungal infections often developed in the damp, sweaty conditions beneath metal and leather. Chronic skin conditions were a constant, uncomfortable companion. Gastrointestinal illness was particularly deadly. Food and water contamination could spread rapidly through a retinue. Diarrhea and vomiting weakened bodies quickly, depleting energy and resilience. In some campaigns, more men died of dysentery or contaminated water than from swords. Strategic planning had to include routes, water sources, and storage methods not merely for logistics, but to prevent collapse from disease. Seasonal challenges compounded these risks. In winter, frostbite and hypothermia were hazards when wet clothing could not dry. In summer, heat exhaustion and sunstroke added strain. Illness weakened the body's ability to tolerate these environmental stressors, making knights more vulnerable in battle and during long marches. Endurance training helped, but it could not eliminate the constant risk of sickness. Epidemics added unpredictability. Smallpox, influenza, and plague appeared intermittently across Europe. Entire villages could be wiped out, and knights were often caught between maintaining their own health, caring for retainers, and continuing campaigns. Sometimes, a march or siege had to be abandoned not because of enemy strength, but because sickness had reduced the army to ineffective numbers. Medical intervention was limited. Surgeons traveled with armies, but knowledge of infection, sterilization, and immunity was rudimentary. The use of poultices, herbal remedies, and bloodletting was based on tradition rather than evidence. Even experienced surgeons could not reliably prevent death from infection. Luck and timing often mattered more than skill. This uncertainty influenced decision-making. Commanders factored in the risk of illness when planning battles, sieges, and marches. Knights learned to monitor themselves and their men for early signs of disease. They developed routines for cleaning armor, rotating bedding, and inspecting wounds. Every small measure mattered in prolonging life and preserving fighting capacity. Psychological effects were profound. The knowledge that death could come from invisible agents, not enemy weapons, created anxiety. Fatigue, boredom, and fear of contagion altered behavior. Knights observed their comrades carefully, noting subtle symptoms, anticipating outbreaks, and sometimes isolating themselves to survive. Vigilance was constant, even when routine appeared mundane. Even outside of campaigns, disease remained a threat. Knights in castles or manors were still exposed to contagion from servants, visitors, and trade. Travel for administrative duties could introduce illness from distant regions. A well-fed, well-armored knight was still vulnerable to microbes beyond sight and comprehension. The slow, unseen nature of disease often went unrecorded in chronicles. Battles left names, dates, and bodies. Epidemics left only gaps in roles, sudden absences, and vague notations. Yet these hidden forces shaped outcomes profoundly. Armies failed not from strategy alone, but from sickness. Leadership faltered when commanders fell ill. Estates struggled when lords were incapacitated. Survival depended on endurance, observation, and management of these invisible threats. This teaches an important truth. Knighthood was not only about physical courage, swordsmanship, or strategy. It was about vigilance against the imperceptible, endurance through monotony and discomfort, and adaptation to circumstances that could not be controlled. The unseen battle against disease required as much skill and as much attention as any engagement on the battlefield. And so, as a knight cleaned a wound, boiled water, inspected a camp, or rationed food during illness, you can imagine the quiet stress underlying daily life. You start to realize that survival was as much a function of observation, hygiene, and careful planning as of armor, weaponry, or bravery. And here lies the lingering question. If invisible threats could determine the outcomes of campaigns and the fates of entire armies, how much of medieval history was shaped not by skill in combat, but by resilience in the face of the microscopic forces that knights could neither fight nor see? By the time a knight completed years of campaigns, sieges, and estate management, it was often not a sword or an enemy that had determined the trajectory of his life, but the unseen, relentless pressure of disease. Illness shaped survival, influenced strategy, and even dictated who wielded power and who faded into obscurity. The hidden wounds of infection, chronic illness, and battlefield injury without proper care were as decisive as any battle, yet they remain largely invisible in history. Consider the aftermath of a minor wound. A small cut acquired in a skirmish might not incapacitate immediately, but infection could develop over days. Pus, swelling, and fever weakened the body. A knight might continue to fight or travel, but his stamina was reduced, his decision-making slower. Campaigns demanded physical and mental sharpness, and the gradual erosion caused by infection often determined whether he could perform effectively or survive. Some knights simply disappeared from records, their deaths unremarked, casualties not of valor but of biology. Chronic injuries compounded the problem. Repeated blows, falls from horses, or stress on joints from heavy armor left lingering pain. Knees, hips, and shoulders deteriorated over time. These injuries limited mobility and endurance, often forcing knights into advisory or administrative roles earlier than expected. Even with careful management, long-term wear often left them reliant on squires and retainers, demonstrating that physical survival depended as much on delegation and adaptation as on personal strength. The psychological burden was equally heavy. Living constantly with the risk of infection or disease demanded vigilance, patience, and self-discipline. Knights became keen observers, noting early signs of sickness among themselves and their retainers. Isolation during fever or precautionary avoidance of contaminated water was sometimes necessary, yet socially complex refusing to eat with retainers or withdrawing from a campaign could be interpreted as weakness or cowardice. Balancing health, duty, and perception required subtlety, judgment, and resilience. Hygiene practices, though limited, were a knight's defense. Armor had to be cleaned to prevent skin diseases. Wounds had to be inspected and dressed with herbs, wine, or vinegar. Clothing and bedding required airing and occasional washing. Every measure counted. Neglect could spread infection through a household or camp. In this way, knights became managers of both people and microbes. Their authority extended into areas invisible to chroniclers. Plagues and epidemics added unpredictability. Even the wealthiest knight was vulnerable. A sudden outbreak could decimate a garrison, overwhelm estates, or force retreat. Logistics and planning mattered, but so did luck. Surviving required both strategic skill and adaptability in the face of conditions beyond control. Decision-making expanded beyond swords and tactics to include the movement of supplies, isolation of the sick, and management of morale under physical stress. Nutrition intertwined with disease. Malnourishment weakened immunity. Scarcity of protein, vegetables, and fresh water increased susceptibility to infection. Campaigns demanded physical exertion even when food was insufficient. Knights learned to balance rationing, calorie management, and meal timing to sustain endurance. Every bite mattered, not only for survival but for leadership credibility. A visibly weakened commander risked losing the confidence of his men. Survival also depended on networks. Heirs, squires, servants, and medical practitioners formed layers of defense against the unseen threats of illness. Knowledge transfer how to clean armor, prepare poultices, manage rations was essential. Experienced knights trained younger men, not only in combat, but in observing, preventing, and managing the conditions that could quietly undo an army. Even with all precautions, mortality was high. Many knights survived battles only to die at home, felled by infection, untreated wounds, or lingering disease. Death could be sudden or slow, often unremarkable, leaving no monument beyond the records of a passing estate or a brief court notation. Unlike a battlefield hero, their passing was quiet, understated, yet no less consequential. Their absence could shift estate management, military leadership, and family succession. And yet knights endured. Their resilience extended beyond the physical. They learned to anticipate invisible threats, manage risk, and maintain function in the face of uncertainty. Success required patience, attention, and adaptation to a world where control was limited. Disease and infection, often overlooked in historical narratives, were forces as powerful as any army or kingdom. Reflecting on this, we begin to see medieval knighthood in a different light. Heroism was not always about valor on the battlefield. It was about vigilance in the mundane, resilience in the face of persistent danger, and survival under conditions that modern readers may scarcely imagine. Armor, swords, and banners symbolized strength, but the true test was enduring the unseen hazards that came with daily life. And here is the question that lingers. If so many battles were won or lost not by tactics, but by endurance against disease and injury, how differently might we understand the stories of knights and the shaping of medieval history, if we measure survival as much by health and resilience as by courage and skill in combat? Story 6. The Silent Tutor's Education, Literacy, and the Mental Life of Knights. When most people imagine a medieval knight, their mind conjures armored figures charging into battle, wielding swords and lances with heroic precision. What they rarely imagine is the other side of knighthood, the slow, invisible work of the mind, the long hours spent reading, memorizing, negotiating, and calculating. Knights were not just warriors. They were administrators, diplomats, and for some, scholars. Education and literacy, though often understated, shaped the reality of medieval life in profound ways. From early childhood, a knight in training, usually a page, was exposed to lessons in discipline and obedience, as well as reading and writing. These skills were not optional, they were essential. Managing land, negotiating alliances, or participating in legal proceedings required more than muscle. A sword could win a battle, but a document could secure a territory or protect an estate. Instruction often began with rote learning. Pages memorized prayers, religious texts, and chivalric codes. Religion permeated daily life. Understanding scripture and ritual was critical, not merely for faith, but for social cohesion. Clergy, lords, and peers judged literacy as a mark of competence. A knight who could read and write was more respected, even if his prowess in battle remained untested. Language skills were highly valued. Latin was the lingua franca of law, diplomacy, and the church. French or Anglo-Norman was used in courts and by the aristocracy in England. A knight who could read multiple languages could negotiate contracts, interpret charters, and communicate with distant allies. Scribes were often employed, but even the most well-supported knights benefited from literacy, understanding exactly what a document said rather than relying blindly on a clerk. Mathematics and accounting were also part of training. Managing an estate, collecting rents, and supervising production demanded numerical competency. Knights kept careful records of obligations owed by tenants and debts owed to them. These calculations required precision. A miscount could cause unrest, financial loss, or legal disputes. Numbers, though mundane, were weapons in their own right. Critical thinking and memory were emphasized. Knights memorized genealogies, feudal obligations, and local customs. Courts and councils relied on accurate knowledge of who owed what, when, and to whom. Forgetting a precedent could undermine authority. Even small errors could escalate into rebellion or litigation. Mental discipline became as crucial as physical endurance. Social skills intertwined with literacy. Knights needed to mediate disputes, negotiate alliances, and navigate complex hierarchies. Understanding etiquette, precedents, and expectation was a learned skill. A poorly delivered command or misinterpreted document could provoke conflict. Language was both tool and shield. Miscommunication could cost lives, land, or reputation. Training was not uniform. Wealth and region affected education. Some knights received extensive tutoring, others learned mainly by observation and apprenticeship. Practical skills often outweighed theoretical ones, but even in the most austere households, basic literacy and arithmetic were considered necessary. Illiterate knights were limited in scope. They could fight and manage physical tasks, but lacked access to broader legal, diplomatic, and administrative arenas. Books were rare and expensive. Parchment and vellum were precious commodities. Libraries existed in monasteries, cathedrals, and some castles, but many knights relied on memorization, oral transmission, or copying texts by hand. Scribes were vital intermediaries, but knights still needed to read instructions, charters, or military orders directly. Mistakes caused by misunderstanding could have severe consequences. Knights also engaged in mental exercises through games and storytelling. Chess, dice, and strategic board games served as tools for developing foresight, planning, and tactical thinking. Oral stories reinforced memory, ethical lessons, and practical wisdom. Even seemingly leisurely activities had an educational function, strengthening the mind in ways that complemented physical training. Religious and moral instruction was constant. Ethics, justice, and chivalric ideals were not theoretical, they guided decisions daily. A knight who violated these principles risked social and political consequences. Moral education shaped not only behavior but reputation, which in a tightly networked society was a form of survival. Psychological resilience was fostered through isolation and reflection. Pages and squires spent long hours in solitude, practicing reading, recitation, or meditation. Silence and repetition trained patience, focus, and emotional control, qualities critical for leadership and survival. Mental endurance became a foundation for physical courage, complementing the development of strength and skill. As you observe this intellectual side of knighthood, it becomes clear that the life of a knight was not defined solely by battle or ceremony. Long-term survival, effective governance, and strategic influence required a disciplined mind. Education shaped how knights managed land, negotiated alliances, and responded to threats visible or invisible. And here is the lingering question. If so much of a knight's power derived from intellect, memory, and literacy rather than swords, how much of history's medieval landscape was molded by these quiet, unseen mental labors rather than by combat alone? As knights matured, education became not just a tool for survival but a pathway to influence. The mental life of a knight was woven deeply into every aspect of their responsibilities, from land management to diplomacy and warfare. Literacy, numeracy, and critical thinking shaped power in ways that the sword could not. Letters, charters, and legal documents were central to authority. A knight who could interpret, draft, or challenge written materials wielded control over property, alliances, and disputes. Illiterate knights relied heavily on scribes, but without comprehension, they risked exploitation or mismanagement. To survive and thrive, a knight had to engage actively with the written word. Documents were not mere formalities, they were instruments of power, enforcement, and legacy. Consider land administration. Medieval estates were complex, with overlapping rights, obligations, and tenants. A knight had to know the family histories of his subjects, what obligations were owed, and the precedents set by prior lords. Records might be sparse, inconsistent, or contradictory, requiring careful cross-checking, consultation, and memorization. Failure to accurately recall or interpret obligations could provoke rebellion or legal challenges. Mental acuity became as critical as any weapon, and sometimes more so. Diplomacy was another arena where literacy and intellect mattered. Knights frequently served as envoys or negotiators, representing their lords in courts or assemblies. Understanding subtle differences in language, protocol, and legal terms could prevent wars, secure alliances, or acquire valuable resources. One mistranslated word or misunderstood clause could have strategic consequences, making mental precision essential. In many ways, a knight's influence depended less on physical might than on careful communication and comprehension. Education also intersected with the legal system. Knights often participated in manorial courts, presiding over disputes, fines, and inheritance claims. They interpreted customary law, mediated disagreements, and ensured that feudal obligations were enforced. Knowledge of precedent, memory of prior cases, and careful reasoning were vital. Mistakes could destabilize local authority or provoke revolt. The effectiveness of a knight as a leader was measured by competence in both literacy and judgment. Mathematics reinforced these functions. Calculating rents, measuring land, accounting for harvests, and allocating resources demanded more than guesswork. Knights often learned arithmetic sufficient for these tasks, sometimes supplemented by scribes. Miscalculations could imperil both livelihood and loyalty. Numbers, though mundane, carried enormous strategic significance. Chess and other strategic games mirrored real-life decision-making. Knights trained their foresight, adaptability, and patience through games that rewarded long-term planning and the anticipation of multiple outcomes. These exercises were practical as well as recreational. The ability to think several steps ahead translated directly into managing estates, anticipating enemy movements, or navigating complex social hierarchies. Reading also nurtured moral and ethical understanding. Religious texts, chivalric codes, and philosophical treatises were studied carefully. Knights reflected on justice, loyalty, and the consequences of action. Ethical reasoning was practical. Decisions in courts, battles, and administration could determine social stability. Moral literacy ensured that authority was exercised in a manner recognized as legitimate, reinforcing obedience and trust. Letters carried news, obligations, and opportunity. Knights read correspondence from lords, allies, and rivals. The subtleties of phrasing could imply threat, obligation, or favor. Understanding nuance allowed a knight to act decisively without appearing aggressive or negligent. Misreading intent could provoke disputes or conflict. In this sense, reading was not passive. It was a form of preemptive strategy, as critical as tactical planning on the battlefield. Memory reinforced literacy. With few books at hand, knights relied on recall. They memorized family lineages, regional customs, legal precedents, and prior decisions. This mental map allowed quick and authoritative judgment. Forgetfulness could undermine authority, disrupt governance, and create vulnerability to manipulation. Intellectual discipline was a constant, invisible labor. Social intelligence complemented these skills. Knights needed to navigate hierarchy, alliance, and influence. Understanding the expectations of lords, peers, and vassals allowed them to exercise authority without relying on force. Listening carefully, nodding subtle signals, and remembering prior interactions were as vital as the ability to swing a sword. Diplomacy, observation, and mental calculation combined to shape outcomes daily. Education also created a buffer against unpredictability. Disease, famine, or political upheaval required adaptability. Knights who could reason, read, and plan could survive interruptions in resources, communication breakdowns, or contested authority. Ill-prepared knights faced both physical and social vulnerability. Knowledge became a survival tool as much as literacy became a weapon. The mental discipline fostered through education carried into older age. As combat effectiveness declined, knights transitioned into roles emphasizing administration, mentorship, and diplomacy. Cognitive skills, cultivated over decades, became central to leadership. Strategy, judgment, and foresight carried more weight than muscle memory. Education ensured a continuity of influence even when physical strength waned. And yet, history rarely celebrates this aspect of knighthood. Epic battles, heroic duels, and courtly exploits overshadow years of study, reflection, and mental labor. Yet without these intellectual efforts, knights could not govern effectively, negotiate alliances, or preserve estates. They would have been warriors without authority, strong in body but powerless in society. So, as you imagine a knight in armor, remember, every letter read, every account calculated, every custom memorized contributed silently but decisively to the power and survival of medieval society. The mind was as much a battlefield as the field itself, and literacy was as lethal a weapon as any sword. And the open question remains: if so much of medieval influence rested on education, literacy, and mental discipline, how differently might we understand the successes or failures of knights if we measured intellect alongside valor? As knights matured and assumed responsibility for estates, retinues, and campaigns, the mental training of their youth became the foundation of practical authority. Armor could protect the body, swords could defeat enemies, but it was the intellect, memory, and judgment cultivated over years that sustained long-term survival and influence. Knights who survived into middle age understood that the mind could be as formidable as any battlefield weapon. Daily life demanded continuous cognitive engagement. Administering estates required tracking obligations, monitoring productivity, resolving disputes, and anticipating crises. Legal literacy was essential. Written charters, contracts, and court decisions needed careful interpretation. A single misread clause could provoke unrest, forfeit property, or trigger costly disputes. Mental agility became a vital skill, exercised not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet attention to detail that defined governance. Diplomatic skill was equally critical. Alliances were fragile, forged with promises, marriages, and oaths. Miscommunication or misjudgment could have fatal consequences. A knight might need to negotiate a truce, arbitrate a claim, or advise a lord, all without the benefit of modern communication. Letters carried subtleties. Words mattered. Misreading intent could provoke conflict as surely as misjudging an enemy's strength on the battlefield. Strategic foresight extended beyond war. Seasonal planning, crop rotation, supply logistics, and resource allocation required calculations that balanced short-term survival against long-term stability. Mathematics was not abstract. It was survival. A miscalculation could result in famine, mutiny, or financial ruin. Planning became an exercise in both arithmetic and human psychology, knowing what people would do, not just what they should do. Chess and other strategic games were not mere recreation. They were simulations of command, teaching anticipation, patience, and long-term thinking. Every move trained a knight to evaluate multiple possibilities simultaneously, accounting for uncertainty, risk, and opportunity. These exercises honed judgment in a context where the wrong decision could have real, often irreversible, consequences. The intellectual demands of knighthood also reinforced patience and discipline. Knights spent hours in solitary study, memorizing texts, learning genealogy, and reciting codes of chivalry. These routines cultivated focus, resilience, and emotional regulation qualities essential for leadership under stress. The mental endurance developed in these quiet hours often outweighed the benefit of physical strength when navigating complex social or political situations. Education also reinforced moral authority. Understanding chivalric codes, ethical precepts, and religious doctrine allowed knights to exercise judgment that was perceived as legitimate. Leadership was not simply about coercion. It was about being recognized as capable, fair, and trustworthy. Without literacy and moral training, a knight might win a battle but fail as a ruler or administrator. Influence depended on perception, comprehension, and integrity, mental weapons as sharp as any blade. Experience compounded these advantages. Older knights who survived illness, campaigns, and administrative duties carried accumulated knowledge. They understood the patterns of human behavior, regional customs, and the rhythms of political alliances. Memory became a repository of wisdom, guiding decisions in uncertain or rapidly changing circumstances. Physical skill diminished with age, but intellectual authority often increased, allowing seasoned knights to exert influence well beyond what brute force alone could achieve. Mental acuity was not infallible, but it was versatile. Knights used reasoning, observation, and planning to mitigate risks, distributing provisions, managing retinues, avoiding exposure to disease, and navigating complex social hierarchies. Every decision drew on layers of knowledge, experience, and foresight. Success relied on the ability to anticipate the consequences of both action and inaction, a skill that often determined survival as much as battlefield prowess. Yet, despite the centrality of intellectual skill, history tends to overlook it. Stories celebrate heroic deeds and visible courage, while years of study, careful observation, and disciplined reasoning fade into obscurity. Knights' mental lives shaped estates, armies, and political landscapes, yet these contributions rarely appear in chronicles. Their influence was subtle, slow, and invisible but enduring. In reflecting on this, we see that knighthood was as much about cognition as it was about combat. The disciplined mind allowed knights to govern, negotiate, and endure, while the sword defended what intellect alone could not secure. Education, literacy, and mental training were shields as vital as steel armor, enabling survival, authority, and continuity in a volatile medieval world. And so, as you imagine knights in armor, remember that behind the visual spectacle of jousts and battles lay hours, decades even, of silent intellectual labor. The battles of the mind were fought with equal intensity, and often with higher stakes. Those who mastered both sword and mind shaped the course of history in ways that chronicles rarely record. The lingering question remains: if intellect, literacy, and foresight were as essential to a knight's survival and authority as combat skill, how much of medieval society, politics, and even warfare was ultimately determined by the unseen mental work that supported the visible acts of heroism? Story 7. Armor and Agony: The Physical Toll of Knighthood. When people picture a knight, they often see gleaming armor, polished to perfection, catching the sun on a battlefield. It is easy to imagine that armor was a symbol of invincibility, a protective shell enabling fearless combat. The truth, however, is far more grueling. Armor, while life-saving, was a relentless burden that taxed the body, restricted movement, and defined daily existence as much as any enemy encounter. A full suit of plate armor could weigh between 40 and 60 pounds, distributed over the body, but the weight was deceptive. It did not hang passively. It required constant muscular effort to move, to mount a horse, or to wield weapons effectively. Every action, rising from a bench, climbing stairs, mounting a horse, swinging a sword, required additional exertion. Knights built extraordinary strength to endure this load, but endurance alone could not eliminate the cumulative toll on joints, muscles, and bones. Even with articulated joints, armor restricted natural motion. Squatting, bending, or twisting became awkward and tiring. Simple tasks, like picking up an object from the ground, required careful planning. Combat maneuvers demanded training, coordination, and stamina. A knight in armor might appear unstoppable in imagery, but in practice, every movement consumed energy at a rate far higher than unarmored peers. Heat and ventilation were constant concerns. Metal plates trapped body heat, particularly in summer campaigns. Armor could transform from protection to an oven. Sweat accumulated beneath padding and mail, increasing weight and discomfort, while prolonged exposure risked heat exhaustion or dehydration. Knights trained to endure heat, but no amount of conditioning fully mitigated the physiological stress. Every hour in armor required mental focus as much as physical resilience. Pressure points and bruising were inevitable. Chainmail rubbed against skin, padding compressed muscles, and joints bore constant strain. Over time, repetitive stress injuries became chronic. Shoulders, elbows, knees, and hips deteriorated under the weight and strain. Even elite knights, well-fed and physically trained, developed long-term musculoskeletal issues. Armor preserved life in battle, but eroded comfort and mobility over a lifetime. Mounting and riding horses added another dimension of difficulty. War horses themselves were large and powerful, but controlling them under weight and during maneuvers demanded precise coordination. A knight's armor altered balance and center of gravity. Falls or missteps could result in serious injury, as the weight of the suit compounded trauma. Training on foot was only half the preparation. Riding fully armored required repeated practice to prevent accidents that could be fatal. Endurance mattered more than bursts of speed. Campaigns demanded days of walking, marching, or riding with armor on. A typical military expedition involved long hours on uneven terrain, carrying weapons, shield, and additional gear. Fatigue set in quickly. Knights learned to ration strength, pace themselves, and conserve energy, but exhaustion was constant. A momentary lapse could prove deadly in combat or during hazardous travel. Even in peacetime, armor influenced daily life. Knights performed routine activities supervising labor, traveling to court, or inspecting estates while wearing lighter forms of protective gear. Padding, helmets, and chainmail continued to apply stress, and conditioning remained essential. Armor shaped posture, gait, and even personal routines. Knights often began and ended their days with exercises to maintain strength, flexibility, and endurance. Life in armor was never passive. It was continuous exertion. Illness compounded the burden. Fever, dehydration, or malnutrition magnified the difficulty of moving in armor. A knight weakened by poor nutrition, infection, or fatigue could be incapacitated even without injury. Armor amplified vulnerability to minor ailments because it restricted mobility and increased physical strain. Survival required both physical fitness and attention to health, yet both could be compromised by campaign conditions or household management. The psychological dimension was significant. Knowing the protection armor provided was life-saving encouraged confidence, but it also demanded mental discipline. Knights had to endure discomfort without complaint, maintain focus despite fatigue, and act decisively even when physically taxed. Mental endurance intertwined with physical strain. Armor demanded resilience of body and mind simultaneously. Training regimens reflected these demands. Knights practiced lifting, running, wrestling, and horseback maneuvers to prepare for armored combat. Exercises emphasized both strength and efficiency, conserving energy while maximizing output. Technique mattered as much as raw power. Poor posture or inefficient movement could lead to exhaustion, injury, or reduced combat effectiveness. Mastery of the body in armor was an ongoing challenge throughout life. Injuries were common even in training. Misjudged swings, falls from horses, or collisions could result in bruises, broken bones, or concussions. Recovery was complicated by armor and the necessity to maintain readiness for duty. The physical cost of preparation was cumulative, affecting performance over decades and influencing decisions about engagement, travel, and administration. Despite all this, knights accepted armor as both protection and obligation. It enabled survival in battle, reinforced social identity, and demonstrated status. Its burdens were part of the profession. Endurance, discipline, and adaptation became defining traits. Armor symbolized power, but it exacted a daily, relentless toll that shaped life quietly and continuously. And so, as you picture a knight on horseback, glinting in the sun, consider this. The heroic image obscures a more taxing reality. Each movement carried weight, each step demanded energy, each day wore on the body incrementally. Life in armor was a constant negotiation between protection, endurance, and suffering. This leaves a lingering question. If knights, survival depended as much on enduring the silent agony of armor as on skill in battle, how much of their historical influence was determined by physical resilience alone, rather than courage or strategy? Beyond the daily burden of wearing armor, knights faced a different, harsher reality in the heat of battle. The physical strain of combat under heavy steel transformed training into endurance under life-or-death conditions. Each clash of swords, each charge of a horse, magnified the toll that armor already exacted. The human body, even when trained, was not naturally designed to carry such weight while performing high-intensity maneuvers. A mounted charge illustrates the complexity. A fully armored knight weighing over 200 pounds, including gear and weapons, hurled himself into a mass of enemy lines. Controlling a horse that might weigh an additional 1,200 pounds required tremendous core strength, balance, and coordination. The knight had to swing a lance, resist countermaneuvers, and maintain awareness of the surrounding chaos. Fatigue was immediate and cumulative. A single engagement could leave a knight bruised, exhausted, or dangerously dehydrated. Even when victorious, injuries were inevitable. Blunt trauma from maces, falls from horses, or collisions with other armored combatants caused bruises, broken bones, or joint damage. Armor protected vital organs, but bones, muscles, and joints absorbed repeated stress. Chronic injuries developed over time. Arthritic knees, damaged shoulders, strained backs. Many knights carried these wounds for life, affecting mobility, stamina, and quality of life. Footwork in combat was deceptively taxing. Running, dodging, or maintaining formation required constant engagement of every muscle, often in awkward positions constrained by armor. Chainmail, while flexible, added resistance. Plates, while protective, restricted natural movement. Knights trained for years to move efficiently, but prolonged combat in full gear was a feat of endurance as much as technique. Weapon handling compounded strain. Swords, axes, and maces were heavy, and repeated swings fatigued the shoulders, arms, and core. Even a skilled knight could tire within minutes if the engagement was prolonged. Fatigue slowed reaction time, increased risk of misstep, and amplified vulnerability. Thus, strength and stamina were inseparable from survival, and exhaustion itself became an adversary on the battlefield. Campaigns magnified these challenges. Days of marching in armor, carrying weapons, and sleeping on the ground or hard surfaces taxed endurance further. Injuries accumulated without adequate recovery. Even minor sprains or cuts became significant impediments when combined with continuous exertion. Knights had to pace themselves, balancing readiness for combat with conservation of energy. The demands of survival were relentless. Environmental factors intensified strain. Heat in summer campaigns could lead to heat stroke, while winter expeditions risked frostbite. Armor trapped heat or allowed cold to penetrate. Helmets limited ventilation, and padding retained moisture. Knights learned to monitor their bodies closely, recognizing the subtle signs of overheating, dehydration, or hypothermia. Ignoring these symptoms could be fatal, independent of enemy action. Sleep deprivation was another hidden burden. Knights often rested in camps, poorly sheltered and under threat of attack. Sleeping in armor was rare, but removing and redonning it each time consumed energy and time. Exhaustion from lack of rest compounded fatigue from physical labor, reducing effectiveness in combat and increasing the likelihood of accidents. The long-term consequences of sustained strain were profound. Chronic joint pain, back problems, and muscle degeneration became common in veteran knights. Some experienced limited mobility, reducing their effectiveness both on the battlefield and in administrative duties. Even careful conditioning could not prevent the slow erosion of physical capability over decades of service. Diet and nutrition intersected with physical strain. Knights expended tremendous energy in training and combat. Inadequate or inconsistent food intake compounded fatigue, slowed recovery, and increased vulnerability to illness. Weight management was not a matter of aesthetics. It directly affected endurance in armor. Campaigns highlighted the fine balance between caloric intake, physical performance, and survival. Injury management was rudimentary. Minor wounds could become infected, while fractures or sprains often went untreated for days or weeks. Knights relied on herbal remedies, bandages, and rudimentary splints. Recuperation was often incomplete, forcing combatants to return to duty with lingering injuries. The physical and psychological toll of this cycle was considerable. The armor itself was both shield and subtle adversary. It protected life but demanded daily sacrifice. Survival required more than courage. It demanded careful conditioning, awareness of the body, strategic packing, and mental endurance. A skilled knight was not just a warrior but an athlete, a strategist, and a human calculator of energy, risk, and capacity. Despite the agony, armor was essential. The protection it afforded allowed knights to survive wounds that would have been fatal in lighter clothing. It shaped combat, strategy, and the evolution of military tactics. Yet the cost was quiet, cumulative, and often invisible. The erosion of mobility, the slow development of chronic injuries, the fatigue that determined effectiveness in subtle ways. And so, the persistent question remains. If the armor that made knights invincible also silently drained their bodies and limited longevity, how much of medieval warfare and history was dictated by endurance, physical adaptation, and the silent agony of survival rather than by skill, courage, or strategy alone? For a knight, the story of survival was as much about the body as it was about skill or valor. The physical toll of armor, long campaigns, and repeated combat extended far beyond individual battles. Knights spent decades negotiating the silent, cumulative pressures of strain, fatigue, and injury, an ongoing struggle that was largely invisible to history, yet pivotal to their lives and effectiveness. One of the most persistent challenges was chronic musculoskeletal stress. Knees, hips, and backs bore the brunt of weight, motion, and repeated strain. Even when a knight survived unscathed in combat, years of training, horseback riding, and marching in heavy armor left lasting damage. Pain was normalized, a constant companion that could limit mobility, reduce stamina, and influence tactical decisions. The strongest and most disciplined warriors were often simultaneously contending with internal obstacles, far removed from the immediate dangers of the battlefield. Rehabilitation was limited but creative. Knights relied on massage, stretching, herbal remedies, and careful packing. They learned to work around injuries, using compensatory techniques to maintain combat effectiveness. For instance, a wounded shoulder might limit sword swings, but adjustments in grip, stance, or weapon choice allowed continued participation in battle. Endurance became a skill of adaptation, knowing one's limits, packing exertion, and protecting vulnerable areas without abandoning duty. Armor itself required constant maintenance to preserve both protection and functionality. Chain links had to be inspected, plate hinges lubricated, padding adjusted to prevent sores and bruising. A knight's body and armor were inseparable. Damage to either compromised survival. Daily attention to both human and steel was essential, combining technical skill with physical discipline. Mental fortitude intertwined with physical endurance. Pain, exhaustion, and discomfort required constant attention. Knights developed a capacity to focus despite distraction, to act decisively even when fatigued, and to endure hardship without complaint. These qualities were forged in training, battle, and campaign life. The silent struggle against bodily limitation became a defining element of knighthood, one rarely acknowledged in chronicles or popular imagination. Campaigns highlighted the cumulative burden. Marching long distances with armor, weapons, and supplies accelerated fatigue. Sleeping on hard ground, exposure to weather, and poor nutrition compounded physical stress. Even small injuries could spiral into serious impediments under these conditions. Survival depended on vigilance, monitoring fatigue, conserving energy, and making real-time adjustments to activity. Heat, cold, and moisture added further challenges. Summer campaigns in full armor risked dehydration and heat stroke. Winter expeditions risked frostbite and hypothermia. Helmets trapped heat and restricted ventilation, while padding retained sweat. Knights had to learn to regulate their bodies, remove or adjust layers as necessary, and ensure hydration when water was scarce. These environmental pressures demanded adaptation, discipline, and knowledge of one's own physiological limits. Long-term consequences shaped life beyond active service. Veterans carried injuries and chronic pain into older age, influencing their roles as commanders, estate managers, or advisors. Physical limitations forced creative approaches to leadership, delegation, reliance on aides, and careful planning to avoid unnecessary exertion. Experience, mental acuity, and strategic thinking became increasingly valuable as raw physical prowess diminished. The interplay between armor and survival also shaped tactics. Knights learned to use armor not just for defense, but as an extension of their bodies. Efficient movement, proper weight distribution, and intelligent use of plate and chain allowed them to conserve energy while maximizing protection. Training focused not only on martial technique, but on integrating body and steel into a single, adaptive system. Mastery of movement under load became as critical as skill with weapons. Diet, too, influenced endurance. High-calorie foods sustained exertion, while hydration maintained performance in extreme conditions. Inadequate nutrition amplified fatigue, slowed recovery, and increased susceptibility to injury. Knights learned to balance the demands of combat with the limitations of resources, a delicate calculation requiring awareness, planning, and discipline. Perhaps the most important lesson of armored life was patience. Survival demanded packing, incremental adaptation, and understanding of cumulative strain. Knights learned to respect limits, anticipate problems, and adjust behavior to preserve both body and function. Valor alone could not compensate for exhaustion. Skill alone could not mitigate chronic injury. Success depended on quiet endurance, practiced over years, often without recognition. In the end, armor was both a shield and a challenge. It protected against lethal threats, but its weight and rigidity demanded constant effort. Knights survived not because armor made them invincible, but because they adapted their bodies, minds, and tactics to endure the subtle, relentless pressures it imposed. This invisible struggle shaped their effectiveness, longevity, and ultimately, the outcomes of campaigns and governance. And so, when reflecting on medieval knights, it becomes clear that history often celebrates visible feats, charges, duels, and battlefield heroics, while overlooking the silent, cumulative struggle of the body itself. Survival depended as much on resilience, adaptation, and endurance as on bravery or skill. Armor was a tool, yes, but also a daily challenge that transformed knights into both warriors and athletes in equal measure. The lingering thought remains: if the invisible agony of armor shaped survival, performance, and leadership as much as courage or strategy, how much of the course of medieval history was determined by endurance, adaptation, and quiet physical resilience rather than by valor alone? Story 8. Castles Behind the Curtain: The Hidden Lives of Medieval Nobility. When we envision medieval castles, the imagination leaps to towering stone walls, drawbridges, and heroic knights defending against sieges. What we rarely picture is the daily life that unfolded behind those walls, the hidden routines, obligations, and strategies that structured survival for the noble inhabitants. Castles were not just fortresses. They were microcosms of medieval society, complex centers of administration, domestic labor, and quiet power struggles. For the lords and ladies who resided within, life combined privilege with persistent labor and responsibility. The grandeur of the great hall, tapestries, and ornate furniture was accompanied by endless management tasks. Estates were extensions of the castle, fields needed supervision, rents collected, disputes adjudicated. The noble family relied on the daily oversight of the castle's staff stewards, chamberlains, cooks, and guards to ensure survival and prosperity. A lapse in attention could have cascading consequences. Domestic routines were surprisingly rigorous. Meals were prepared according to strict schedules, with attention to both efficiency and hierarchy. Servants labored for hours to provide bread, meat, and vegetables, often under the scrutiny of noble oversight. Hygiene and sanitation, while rudimentary, required constant attention. Latrines needed maintenance, water supplies had to be monitored, and fires tended for warmth and cooking. The noble family oversaw these operations to maintain both health and authority. Social obligations shaped daily life as much as physical labor. Visitors from neighboring lords to clerics and merchants arrived frequently. Entertaining guests was both a necessity and a performance. The ability to host with decorum reinforced status, solidified alliances, and showcased wealth. Protocol governed seating arrangements, conversation, and the timing of meals. Every gesture, however minor, could carry political weight. Education played a subtle but critical role. Noble children, particularly heirs, received instruction in management, literacy, and diplomacy from tutors. Learning to read Latin or French, understand contracts, and negotiate complex alliances was as essential as swordplay. The survival of estates and the continuation of influence depended on these intellectual skills, quietly cultivated behind the castle walls. Even minor errors in comprehension or etiquette could trigger disputes or undermine authority. Knights and lords also maintained military readiness within the castle. Weapons, armor, and horses required constant care. Training continued indoors or in courtyards, often integrated into daily schedules. The castle was both home and armory. Domestic life and martial preparation coexisted in overlapping routines. Nobility balanced social, administrative, and military duties simultaneously. Economics defined much of castle life. The lord oversaw production, managed trade, and ensured that stores of grain, meat, and other supplies were sufficient. Markets, fairs, and tenant obligations required constant attention. Stockpiling food, negotiating prices, and managing labor were practical exercises in survival. A poorly managed estate risked famine, unrest, or financial collapse, demonstrating that power depended on competence as much as on lineage. Health and sanitation were persistent concerns. Disease, infection, and malnutrition threatened both family and staff. Even minor illness could disrupt operations. Noble households relied on knowledge of herbs, basic remedies, and the advice of clergy or physicians to maintain well-being. Preventive measures, careful supervision, and contingency planning were as vital as the defense of walls or weapons. Political maneuvering often occurred quietly. Alliances were forged through marriage, land grants, and negotiated privileges. The castle was a center of negotiation and intrigue, as much as a defensive structure. Maintaining influence required constant attention to loyalty, reputation, and protocol. Missed opportunities, misunderstandings, or perceived slights could shift the balance of power within a region. Nobles had to manage relationships as carefully as they managed resources or defenses. Leisure was rare but purposeful. Hunting, falconry, and music served multiple functions, demonstrating skill, reinforcing social bonds, and cultivating personal discipline. These activities were often intertwined with political objectives, ensuring that pleasure was never entirely divorced from strategy or survival. Even entertainment had consequences in shaping perception, reputation, and alliances. The castle also sheltered secrets, from hidden chambers to encrypted messages. These spaces were practical, safeguarding valuables, maintaining confidential communication, or concealing sensitive operations. Nobles navigated a world where information was power. Understanding who knew what, when, and how was essential for security, governance, and influence. Observation, discretion, and subtlety were constant requirements. Daily life was structured around repetition, detail, and management of human and material resources. The glamour of medieval nobility often obscures the laborious, disciplined, and meticulous practices that sustained estates, maintained health, and preserved influence. The walls of the castle concealed not only luxury but persistent work, planning, and strategic thinking, an invisible foundation for survival, prosperity, and power. And so, the lingering question emerges. If castles were not merely fortresses but intricate centers of labor, diplomacy, and management, how much of medieval political power and survival depended on the hidden routines of domestic life rather than the dramatic clashes outside the walls? Inside the castle walls, the daily operations of nobility were as delicate and complex as a battlefield campaign, though less visible to the chronicler. The household staff, the stewards, chamberlains, cooks, stable hands, and guards formed the backbone of castle life, yet their labor was largely invisible. The noble family depended on this intricate network of service to maintain stability, enforce authority, and protect survival, both physically and politically. The steward, often the highest-ranking servant, managed resources, supervised labor, and oversaw the collection of rents or production from surrounding lands. This position required literacy, numeracy, and knowledge of regional customs. The steward served as a translator between the noble household and external society, tenants, merchants, and visiting officials. Errors in judgment could disrupt supply chains, provoke unrest, or even threaten the family's survival. Chamberlains and attendants maintained daily routines of the household. They monitored food stores, heating, lighting, and the cleanliness of living spaces. Every detail mattered. Spoiled food could lead to illness, poorly maintained bedding could foster infection, and unguarded valuables could be stolen. Nobles relied on these servants to implement careful protocols. Their oversight allowed the family to function in comfort and safety. Even minor lapses could ripple outward, endangering health, reputation, or political standing. Secret spaces and hidden compartments added another layer of subtlety. Many castles contained concealed rooms for safeguarding valuables, storing sensitive documents, or sheltering those under threat. These spaces were practical and strategic. Nobles understood that information and resources had to be protected not just from external enemies, but sometimes from internal threats. Staff were trained in discretion, loyalty, and observation skills, as critical to survival as combat training for a knight. Communication was a quiet art. Nobles wrote letters, sent messengers, and conducted negotiations that often shaped alliances or resolved disputes before they became violent. Knowledge of etiquette, timing, and phrasing could prevent conflicts, secure advantageous marriages, or facilitate trade. Literacy was not merely academic. It was a tool of governance, diplomacy, and survival. Miscommunication could provoke rebellion or alienate allies, demonstrating that the pen and mind were weapons in their own right. Daily routines reinforced hierarchy. Meals, prayers, and inspections were scheduled precisely, reinforcing social order and ensuring operational efficiency. Nobles observed these patterns as much for control as for convenience. The visible structure of ritualized life reflected a deeper structure of labor, loyalty, and accountability. Staff understood that compliance was rewarded, negligence punished, and perception mattered as much as performance. Health was a constant concern, not just for the noble family but for the entire household. Disease could spread rapidly in enclosed spaces, disrupting operations and threatening life. Preventive measures, cleaning, food preparation, and monitoring water were labor-intensive but essential. Even minor illnesses could incapacitate key staff, forcing nobles to intervene or improvise. Knowledge of remedies, herbs, and simple hygiene became a form of applied science that reinforced survival. Leisure and training were intertwined with function. Hunting, falconry, and organized games were exercises in skill, observation, and endurance. Music, dance, and storytelling were not purely entertainment. They reinforced social bonds, cultural literacy, and morale. Every activity contributed indirectly to political and social stability, shaping perception and influence. Nobles cultivated talent and skill deliberately, knowing that appearances and subtle competency mattered as much as raw power. Security was always present. Guards patrolled walls, gates were monitored, and access controlled. Yet internal security was equally important. Trust had to be balanced with vigilance. Household members could observe, report, or conceal behaviors that might affect the family. The dynamics of loyalty and discretion were subtle but essential, shaping who wielded influence and how authority was maintained behind the stone walls. Education extended into practical skills. Noble children, heirs and daughters alike, were taught to read, write, manage accounts, and understand legal obligations. Practical wisdom, how to resolve disputes, manage servants, and anticipate consequences, was integrated into everyday life. These lessons were as crucial as any martial training, ensuring that the next generation could continue governance, maintain alliances, and navigate crises. Survival and influence were inseparable from intellectual and practical competence. Even ceremonial life was strategic. Banquets, receptions, and public appearances reinforced social networks, projected power, and signaled wealth. Every detail, seating arrangements, the order of service, or even conversation carried weight. Protocol was a form of soft power, shaping relationships and expectations subtly but effectively. Nobles understood that reputation, cultivated quietly behind the curtain of domestic life, could determine political outcomes far more than public displays of strength. Thus, the castle was both a fortress and a stage. Its walls protected, its architecture facilitated labor, and its daily routines reinforced hierarchy, stability, and strategy. Noble life, though glamorous in appearance, was a complex balance of management, observation, and subtle influence. The true power of the castle was often invisible, the quiet, precise orchestration of human and material resources that ensured survival, health, and political leverage. The lingering question remains: if the survival and influence of medieval nobility depended so much on meticulous domestic management, education, and subtle diplomacy behind closed doors, how much of history was shaped not by battles or heroism, but by the quiet, unrecorded labor that sustained power within the castle walls? By the time a noble reached adulthood, the rhythms of castle life had become second nature. Yet, what was apparent, the great halls, the tapestries, the knights on patrol, only hinted at the true engine of influence: the constant, invisible labor and vigilance that allowed the family to survive, prosper, and maintain authority. Castles were as much administrative centers and households as they were fortresses, and the quiet work behind the scenes shaped medieval politics as surely as battles did. Daily governance demanded constant attention. Estate management extended beyond simple supervision of fields and livestock. It involved monitoring tenants, obligations, collecting dues, resolving disputes, and adjudicating inheritance claims. A lord needed an intimate understanding of every aspect of his domain, from the fertility of fields to the reliability of serfs, to maintain both wealth and loyalty. Even minor errors could destabilize authority, provoke rebellion, or undermine alliances. The household network was pivotal. Stewards, chamberlains, cooks, and guards were not merely servants, they were the machinery that allowed the noble family to function. Their competence, loyalty, and observation were critical to survival. Training, supervision, and trust building were constant responsibilities. A mismanaged household could compromise both security and reputation, while effective management amplified influence and consolidated power. Secrecy and discretion were equally vital. Hidden chambers, guarded documents, and confidential communication allowed nobles to act strategically without exposing vulnerabilities. Knowing what information to reveal, to whom, and when was as important as maintaining walls or armies. Intelligence about allies, rivals, or regional conditions was power, and its careful handling often determined political outcomes far more than visible displays of strength. Education and intellectual cultivation reinforced authority. Literacy, numeracy, and knowledge of law allowed nobles to engage directly with contracts, correspondence, and treaties. They could assess risk, negotiate effectively, and interpret obligations accurately. Even within the castle, mental discipline was as crucial as physical discipline. The ability to recall precedents, calculate resources, and manage complex relationships under pressure shaped decision-making and influence. Leisure, while appearing indulgent, was equally purposeful. Hunting, falconry, and music were exercises in observation, patience, and strategic thinking. Ceremonial events, banquets, and public appearances served to reinforce social networks, project wealth, and demonstrate competence. Every gesture, every detail, communicated status, expectation, and authority. The nobility's public image was carefully curated, built on the quiet labor of preparation and rehearsal behind closed doors. Health and hygiene, often overlooked in romanticized depictions of castles, were matters of survival. Disease spread quickly in enclosed spaces. Food safety, water quality, and sanitation required attention, inspection, and action. Even a small outbreak could disrupt daily routines, weaken labor, and threaten lives. Knowledge of remedies, preventive practices, and household routines allowed nobles to maintain continuity and stability. Survival depended on vigilance, foresight, and careful management of people and resources. Conflict rarely remained entirely external. Power struggles could emerge within the household, between relatives, or among retainers. Diplomacy, judgment, and observation were essential. Nobles had to assess loyalty, anticipate behavior, and mediate disputes. Authority was reinforced not by physical force alone, but by perception, skillful management, and the quiet orchestration of human behavior. The invisible threads of control often determined the real strength of a castle, more than its walls or weaponry. Economic competence reinforced influence. Managing revenue from lands, taxation, and trade required diligence. Nobles tracked supplies, monitored markets, and balanced obligations with expenditures. Mistakes could create scarcity, unrest, or financial vulnerability. The survival of a family's wealth and its capacity to sustain military or political endeavors depended on meticulous record-keeping, oversight, and strategic foresight. In essence, life within the castle was a constant negotiation between visibility and invisibility. Public acts, the ringing of bells, the display of armor, the presence in courts were supported by a vast network of hidden labor, intellectual work, and disciplined routines. The nobility's influence depended on the quiet orchestration of domestic, administrative, and diplomatic systems that were rarely celebrated, yet shaped history profoundly. Reflecting on this hidden life, it becomes clear that castles were more than fortresses. They were complex machines of survival, governance, and influence. The real power of the medieval noble lay not in the walls or the armaments, but in the knowledge, discipline, and careful management that ensured the household and estate functioned seamlessly, even under pressure. Authority was exercised quietly, deliberately, and often invisibly. And the question lingers: if the visible grandeur and martial prowess of nobility were only the tip of the iceberg, how much of medieval history, political stability, succession, and regional influence was ultimately determined by the invisible work, strategic foresight, and careful management behind castle walls, rather than by open battles or dramatic acts of heroism? Story 9. Food, famine, and feasts. Nutrition in the medieval world. When we imagine the life of a medieval knight or noble, it's easy to focus on armor, battles, and castles. What rarely comes to mind is the humble reality that survival depended on something far more basic: food. The medieval diet shaped health, endurance, and even military outcomes, influencing daily life in ways that were both mundane and profound. Hunger, scarcity, and the management of resources were constant concerns, affecting the rich and poor alike. Daily meals varied greatly depending on status, location, and season. For peasants, subsistence often meant coarse bread, porridge, legumes, and occasional vegetables. Meat was rare, usually reserved for festivals or exceptional circumstances. Grains were central, providing calories but lacking in protein and essential nutrients. Hunger was common, and malnutrition weakened bodies, lowered resistance to disease, and limited productivity. Survival depended not only on what was eaten, but on the careful timing and rationing of food. Knights and nobles had more options, but even their diets were bound by seasonal availability, preservation methods, and logistical constraints. Meat, fish, bread, cheese, and vegetables appeared regularly, supplemented with fruits, eggs, and dairy. Spices, often expensive imports, added flavor but also reflected status. Meals were planned carefully. Overconsumption could cause lethargy during campaigns, while undernutrition could reduce endurance. Knights learned to balance energy intake with the physical demands of training and battle. Preservation was a constant concern. Fresh food spoiled quickly, particularly in summer heat. Salt, smoking, pickling, and fermentation were essential techniques. Knights, estates maintained salt houses, smokehouses, and cellars to ensure a steady supply. Failure to preserve adequately could lead to scarcity, illness, or weakened troops. Knowledge of preservation was as vital as combat skill in sustaining life and military readiness. Famine was a recurring threat. Crop failures due to drought, flood, or pestilence could devastate regions, triggering social unrest, migration, and mortality. Even the wealthiest households faced challenges securing sufficient food during lean years. Nobles had to anticipate shortages, stockpile reserves, and negotiate access to markets or neighboring estates. Survival depended not only on abundance but on foresight, planning, and careful management. Military campaigns magnified nutritional challenges. Knights on the move could not rely on steady access to fresh food. Hardtack, salted meat, and preserved grains formed the bulk of rations, supplemented by hunted game when available. Fatigue and injury were amplified by insufficient nutrition, and chronic underfeeding could reduce combat effectiveness. Commanders learned to ration, prioritize, and improvise, understanding that hunger could be as dangerous as enemy attack. Food also reinforced social hierarchy. Feasts celebrated victories, alliances, or religious observances. These events were displays of wealth, hospitality, and influence. The quality, quantity, and presentation of food communicated status, cultivated loyalty, and reinforced social bonds. Yet behind every banquet lay laborious preparation, careful planning, and resource management, another layer of invisible work supporting the social and political order. Nutrition influenced health beyond energy. Diets deficient in essential vitamins and minerals caused scurvy, rickets, or anemia, weakening bodies over time. Children were especially vulnerable. Chronic malnutrition contributed to susceptibility to disease, slower recovery from injury, and reduced lifespan. Knowledge of diet, supplementation, and resource management was critical for families seeking long-term survival. Even minor disruptions in supply could ripple through society. Poor harvests affected prices, trade, and access to staples. Peasants and laborers faced starvation first. Nobles sometimes resorted to rationing or importation. Diplomacy could hinge on securing access to grain or livestock. Food was not merely sustenance, it was power, currency, and a determinant of social stability. Ritualized eating reflected awareness of its importance. Mealtimes were structured, portions distributed carefully, and food preparation observed closely for both health and status. Monastic advice on diet influenced noble households, blending religious discipline with practical guidance. Meals became moments of both sustenance and subtle education, observing etiquette, cultivating patience, and learning the rhythms of social expectation. Hydration mattered as much as food. Clean water was often scarce. Rivers, wells, and cisterns were monitored carefully. Contaminated water could trigger outbreaks of dysentery or other deadly illnesses. Knights and nobles relied on boiled or filtered water when possible, and ale or wine was sometimes safer due to fermentation. Understanding how to maintain both hydration and health was an essential survival skill. In sum, the medieval diet, though unglamorous, was central to life, survival, and even military outcomes. Hunger, preservation, and resource management shaped decisions at every level from peasant laborers to battlefield strategy. The mundane act of eating became a delicate negotiation between biology, environment, and social hierarchy. Nutrition was a silent but decisive factor in survival, endurance, and historical trajectories. And the question that lingers: if battles were fought not only with swords but with the careful rationing of food, the management of harvests, and the strategic distribution of resources, how differently might we understand the successes and failures of knights, armies, and estates in the medieval world? Beyond the daily routines of eating, food in the medieval world was a strategic resource. It determined the endurance of armies, the stability of estates, and the resilience of entire communities. Knights and nobles understood that survival was as much about anticipating shortages, rationing supplies, and managing logistics as it was about combat skill or political alliances. Crop cycles dictated availability. Grain was the cornerstone of both peasant and noble diets, yet harvests were vulnerable to weather, pests, and disease. A failed harvest could spark famine, force migration, or weaken military forces. Nobles maintained granaries, barns, and storage systems designed to preserve food for lean years. Even with foresight, scarcity could arrive suddenly. Droughts, floods, or infestations were unpredictable, and estates that lacked preparation faced social and economic consequences. Preservation techniques were crucial to extending the lifespan of perishable goods. Salting and smoking meat, pickling vegetables, and drying fruits allowed supplies to last through winters or long campaigns. Knights relied on these techniques not only to feed themselves, but also to provision troops. Failure in preservation could leave soldiers undernourished, fatigued, and vulnerable, directly affecting the outcome of battles and sieges. Military campaigns were particularly dependent on food logistics. Armies marched for days or weeks with limited access to fresh supplies. Knights carried preserved rations, hardtack, salted meat, dried legumes, but these were far from ideal nutrition. Fatigue, exposure, and injury were exacerbated by inadequate food. Commanders had to balance speed, strength, and supply, sometimes making strategic decisions based on available provisions rather than purely tactical considerations. Hunger also shaped behavior and morale. Armies that went without sufficient food suffered not only physically but psychologically. Desertion, insubordination, and mutiny were real risks. Knowledge of local resources, hunting and foraging became tactical advantages. A commander who could secure provisions might prevent collapse even in adverse conditions. Thus, understanding food was as essential to leadership as understanding terrain or enemy strategy. Nutrition directly influenced physical capacity. Protein, calories, and hydration were critical for strength, endurance, and recovery from wounds. Malnourished soldiers, peasants, or knights were slower, weaker, and more prone to illness. Chronic deficiencies undermined long-term health, limiting lifespan and productivity. Nobles who ignored diet risked diminished capacity to defend estates, govern lands, or lead troops effectively. Feasts were more than displays of wealth; they reinforced social cohesion and strategic alliances. Celebratory meals marked victories, marriages, or religious occasions. The abundance of food communicated power, while the act of sharing reinforced loyalty and obligation. Nobles understood that the symbolic and practical aspects of food reinforced their authority and relationships. Every banquet was a subtle negotiation of status, obligation, and influence. Food scarcity also amplified social inequality. Peasants faced hunger first, their limited rations and dependence on landlords. Generosity made them vulnerable. Nobles, while insulated, were not immune. They had to anticipate shortages, maintain reserves, and sometimes negotiate for additional resources. Survival required planning, adaptation, and careful allocation of both food and labor. Seasonal fluctuations shaped the rhythm of life. Spring planting, summer maintenance, autumn harvest, and winter storage dictated activity. Knights and nobles monitored production carefully, assigning labor, inspecting yields, and negotiating surplus management. Miscalculations could have cascading effects on income, military readiness, and social stability. Food management was thus central to economic, military, and social strategy. Dietary knowledge influenced health beyond immediate energy needs. Deficiencies in vitamins, minerals, or protein caused disease, stunted growth, or reduced resilience. Knowledge of herbal remedies, dietary supplements, and proper food handling mitigated some risks. Nobles who ignored nutrition risked not only immediate fatigue but long-term deterioration, while those who mastered food logistics enjoyed greater endurance, vitality, and strategic advantage. Even water mattered. Clean sources were limited, and contaminated water could spread deadly illness. Knights and household managers monitored wells, cisterns, and rivers carefully. Ale or wine were sometimes safer due to fermentation, but hydration remained critical. The management of water, like food, became a strategic and survival skill, essential for both daily life and military operations. In sum, nutrition was inseparable from survival, authority, and strategy in the medieval world. Hunger, scarcity, and the management of resources influenced health, morale, and political stability. Food was a quiet but decisive factor in the endurance of armies, the prosperity of estates, and the success of campaigns. What seems mundane bread, meat, or vegetables was often the hidden determinant of historical outcomes. And the lingering question remains: if the endurance of knights, peasants, and nobles depended so heavily on the careful management of food, preservation, and nutrition, how many victories, defeats, or political shifts were ultimately decided not by strategy or courage, but by what people were able or unable to eat? As we consider medieval life, it becomes clear that food was not merely a matter of sustenance, it was a force that shaped social hierarchies, military campaigns, and political decisions. Survival, strength, and authority were intimately tied to what was eaten, how it was preserved, and how it was distributed. Understanding this reveals a hidden layer of medieval history, one where bread, meat, and ale could determine the fate of kingdoms. For peasants, scarcity defined existence. Poor harvests meant hunger, malnutrition, and vulnerability to disease. Children often faced stunted growth, while adults endured weakened bodies that could not perform arduous labor. Peasant communities were tightly bound to seasonal rhythms. Failure to manage food resources effectively could lead to widespread famine. Rebellions sometimes erupted not because of oppression alone, but because scarcity threatened life itself. Even minor disruptions in grain supply could have cascading social consequences. Knights and nobles, though insulated from the most extreme deprivation, were not immune. Military campaigns highlighted the critical importance of logistics. Armies could not function without steady rations. Sieges, long marches, and extended battles placed enormous strain on physical endurance. A commander might postpone an assault, redirect forces, or abandon a campaign if provisions were insufficient. Food availability was a tactical consideration, as vital as troop strength or terrain. Feasts, while celebratory, were strategic. Sharing food reinforced loyalty, solidified alliances, and communicated abundance. A well-provisioned table was a display of power, while scarcity or poor hospitality could signal weakness. Diplomacy was conducted as much over bread and wine as in written contracts or formal negotiation. In this sense, nutrition was a subtle instrument of influence and persuasion, quietly shaping relationships and reinforcing social hierarchies. The long-term effects of nutrition extended to health and military readiness. Protein-rich diets supported muscular development, strength, and endurance essential for knights in combat or laborers in the fields. Conversely, chronic deficiencies led to weakness, illness, and reduced lifespan. Disease was compounded by undernutrition. Immune resilience was a direct consequence of diet. Inadequate nutrition could reduce not only personal survival, but the capacity of an estate or army to function effectively. Preservation techniques were as much survival skills as culinary practices. Salted meat, smoked fish, dried legumes, and pickled vegetables allowed families and armies to endure lean periods. Granaries, cellars, and smokehouses were carefully maintained. Mismanagement could trigger starvation, social unrest, or even military defeat. Those who mastered these techniques gained a quiet but decisive advantage, reinforcing the importance of preparation, foresight, and discipline. Seasonality governed life. Planting, harvesting, and storing dictated schedules for peasants, knights, and nobles alike. Surplus management became a practical form of strategy. Distributing or hoarding grain affected relations with tenants, neighboring estates, and armies. Shortages could spark tension. Abundance could consolidate power. Food management was not passive, it was an active, strategic exercise with far-reaching implications. Diet also influenced morale. Soldiers, laborers, and household members were more effective, cooperative, and resilient when adequately nourished. Fatigue, irritability, and vulnerability increased with hunger. Commanders and household managers who ignored nutrition risked both physical and psychological decline among those under their care. Food was as much a tool for governance and control as a source of energy. Even water management intersected with nutrition and survival. Wells, cisterns, and rivers had to be monitored to prevent contamination. In some regions, fermented beverages were safer than water, highlighting the ingenuity required to sustain life. Understanding how to balance hydration with food intake and how to protect sources from disease was an essential component of strategy and daily management. Ultimately, food defined the rhythm and resilience of medieval life. Hunger, preservation, rationing, and feasting were intertwined with health, social order, military effectiveness, and political influence. The most celebrated battles, sieges, and campaigns were often won or lost based not on valor alone, but on the quiet, strategic management of provisions. The mundane act of eating shaped the extraordinary events that historians record. As you imagine medieval life, consider this. Behind every successful campaign, thriving estate, or influential household, there was an unseen infrastructure of nutrition, preservation, and careful planning. Food was both lifeline and instrument of power, a hidden determinant of human endurance, social hierarchy, and historical outcome. The question that lingers is this: if armies, estates, and even kingdoms could rise or fall based on what people ate or failed to eat, how might our understanding of medieval history change if we measured victory not just by swords or strategy, but by bread, grain, and the quiet management of nourishment? Story 10. Plague, pestilence, and the fragility of life. The Middle Ages were a time when survival hung by a fragile thread. Disease was a constant companion, lurking invisibly in crowded towns, castles, and farmlands. While battles, famines, and political struggles dominate popular imagination, it was pestilence, the quiet, indiscriminate enemy that often dictated who lived, who died, and how societies evolved. Plague and disease shaped lives in ways far subtler and more devastating than any army or siege. Life expectancy was precariously low. Infants and children faced the highest mortality rates, and even adults were susceptible to recurring fevers, infections, and epidemic outbreaks. The causes were poorly understood. Miasmas, celestial influences, or divine wrath were common explanations. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Herbs, bloodletting, and prayers were relied upon, often with little effect. Survival depended as much on luck and isolation as on skill or status. Crowded urban centers amplified vulnerability. Towns lacked sanitation, waste disposal was minimal, and rivers were often polluted. Fleas, lice, and rodents thrived in these conditions, carrying pathogens that could devastate entire populations. Even modest outbreaks could spread rapidly, transforming towns into places of fear, isolation, and death. Those who survived did so through distance, cautious habits, or sheer fortune. The impact on nobility and knights was also profound. Castles, while fortified against physical attack, could not protect against disease. Close quarters, visiting retainers, and traveling messengers introduced contagion. Estates, though better supplied and more isolated, were still vulnerable. Noble families witnessed children, heirs, and household staff succumb to illness. The management of health became a constant preoccupation. Cleaning, isolation, and rudimentary remedies were as essential as any military preparation. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, exemplifies the scale of devastation. Estimates suggest that between one-third and half of Europe's population perished in just a few years. Entire villages vanished, labor markets collapsed, and social hierarchies were shaken. Survival required a combination of precaution, mobility, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism. Nobles and peasants alike faced choices that weighed social obligation against personal survival. Psychological consequences were immense. Fear permeated daily life. Travel, trade, and social interaction became dangerous. Communities retreated inward and superstition flourished. Quarantines, religious processions, and scapegoating were attempts to manage uncertainty. Knowledge of contagion was limited, and invisible forces seemed to control life and death. Yet survival often depended on observation, practical hygiene, and strategic avoidance of risk precursors to the modern understanding of epidemiology. Economics were disrupted by disease. Labor shortages raised wages for surviving workers, while estates struggled to maintain production. Prices fluctuated, trade slowed or ceased. Food scarcity compounded the impact of illness. Families and communities adapted in diverse ways, consolidating resources, relocating, or enforcing rationing. Nobles who survived could wield increased power, while entire communities collapsed under the weight of mortality. The spread of plague was not uniform. Geography, climate, and mobility determined which regions were hardest hit. Urban centers with trade connections suffered first, while isolated villages sometimes avoided catastrophe. Nobles who monitored movement, restricted access, and controlled interactions sometimes gained a critical survival advantage. Disease became both a physical and strategic challenge, influencing decisions at every level of society. The social consequences of pestilence were profound. Labor shortages empowered peasants to demand better conditions, while the sudden loss of clergy, officials, and skilled workers disrupted institutions. Survivors faced shifts in power, inheritance, and societal expectations. Entire generations experienced trauma, loss, and uncertainty, shaping cultural memory and the development of law, custom, and governance. Medical practice remained limited. Physicians relied on classical texts, astrology, and herbal remedies, often unaware of the microbial causes of disease. Treatments were inconsistent, sometimes harmful, and largely ineffective. Families relied on domestic knowledge, religious intervention, and isolation measures. Prevention was pragmatic: avoid contact, maintain cleanliness, and avoid risk where possible. The stakes were literal. Mistakes could be fatal. Even the rhythm of daily life was dictated by disease. Social interaction, work schedules, travel, and religious practice were adjusted in response to outbreaks. Awareness of invisible threats shaped behavior, influenced alliances, and sometimes even delayed military campaigns. Survival required constant vigilance, attention to detail, and strategic adaptation to an unpredictable environment. And so, as you consider the medieval world, it becomes clear that the specter of plague and pestilence dominated experience as much as war or politics. Life was precarious, and the invisible enemy shaped outcomes quietly but decisively. Behind every historical event, there lurked the subtle, persistent influence of disease, a force that could kill, reorganize society, and alter the trajectory of history without a single sword being drawn. The lingering question remains: if invisible pathogens could topple armies, destabilize estates, and reshape society, how many historical victories, defeats, and political shifts were ultimately determined not by strategy, courage, or diplomacy, but by the silent, invisible hand of disease? As plague and disease swept through medieval Europe, survival became a complex negotiation between biology, behavior, and circumstance. Unlike armies that could retreat or reorganize, ordinary people and even nobles faced threats that were invisible, unpredictable, and indiscriminate. Adaptation through observation, precaution, and sometimes radical choices was often the difference between life and death. Isolation became a practical tool long before the science of contagion existed. Towns or households that limited contact with outsiders often fared better during outbreaks. Nobles sometimes sealed themselves within fortified castles, restricting access to servants, messengers, and neighbors. Peasant families avoided markets, communal gatherings, and other points of contact when disease was rampant. These strategies were not driven by understanding of germs, but by careful observation of patterns. Those who interacted with the sick often succumbed first. Hygiene, rudimentary by modern standards, was nevertheless significant. Regular cleaning of living spaces, disposal of waste, and careful handling of water and food helped reduce exposure. Some households established quarantines for the sick, separating them from the healthy. Even practices that were rooted in superstition, burning herbs, fumigating rooms, or controlling odors, sometimes had unintended protective effects. Survival required vigilance, attention to detail, and adherence to routines that reduced risk as much as possible. Mobility was another form of adaptation. When plague threatened, families sometimes abandoned villages, fleeing to isolated farms or forests. Nobles could relocate courts, while peasants often had no choice but to follow work or abandon land temporarily. While flight carried its own dangers, lack of supplies, exposure, and vulnerability to bandits, it sometimes spared life. Strategic relocation became a quiet form of survival, an uncelebrated but decisive factor in who endured epidemics. Medical interventions were inconsistent. Physicians relied on humoral theory, astrology, and herbal remedies, often providing treatments that were ineffective or harmful. Families turned to domestic knowledge, preparing herbal concoctions or following ritualized remedies. Religious practice, prayers, processions, and pilgrimages offered both psychological comfort and social cohesion. These practices, while largely symbolic, shaped behavior, enforced community norms, and helped people cope with uncertainty. The plague also reshaped social structures. Labor shortages elevated the bargaining power of peasants, allowing them to demand higher wages, better treatment, or tenancy rights. Entire estates and towns were reorganized in response to demographic collapse. Nobles who survived sometimes found increased authority, as weakened neighbors left gaps in power. Disease, therefore, was both a destructive and transformative force, influencing social hierarchy, labor relations, and governance. Communication and observation were key survival skills. Families, lords, and town councils monitored outbreaks in neighboring regions, adjusting trade, travel, and work accordingly. Knowledge of local conditions allowed strategic planning: when to move livestock, when to harvest crops, and when to isolate populations. Awareness and prudence often determined not just individual survival, but the resilience of entire communities. Food management intersected critically with disease. Malnutrition weakened resistance, making infections more deadly. Estates and households had to ensure sufficient calories, protein, and safe water, even as epidemics disrupted labor and supply chains. Nobles, knights, and peasants alike relied on preservation techniques, rationing, and resource prioritization. Survival required balancing immediate needs against long-term resilience. Psychological stress compounded the physical dangers. The constant threat of sudden illness, the loss of neighbors and family, and the unpredictability of outbreaks created pervasive anxiety. Communities developed coping mechanisms, rituals, storytelling, and shared mourning that reinforced social bonds and provided some measure of mental endurance. These subtle adaptations were as critical to survival as any practical measures. Even warfare and politics were shaped by disease. Armies weakened by plague were ineffective, sieges slowed, and campaigns postponed. Nobles adjusted priorities, sometimes favoring defense or negotiation over offensive action. Disease was a silent, strategic factor, influencing the timing and outcome of conflicts. Leadership increasingly required awareness of epidemiological conditions as much as battlefield skill. And so, plague was not merely a medical problem. It was a social, political, and strategic force. Survival depended on observation, adaptation, and careful management of resources, behavior, and human networks. The medieval world was shaped by the invisible pressures of pestilence, and those who endured were often those who combined prudence, resilience, and foresight. The lingering question remains: if epidemics could disrupt armies, estates, and social hierarchies, how many historical events, political shifts, and societal transformations were ultimately dictated by human adaptation to disease rather than by strategy, combat, or leadership alone? By the time the plague receded in a region, the landscape, both physical and social, was irrevocably altered. Villages emptied, towns depopulated, and entire communities vanished. Survivors inherited not only the land and resources of the deceased, but also the responsibility of rebuilding economies, governance, and social networks. Disease had acted as an invisible hand, reshaping medieval society quietly but decisively. Economically, labor shortages transformed relationships between peasants and lords. Surviving workers demanded higher wages, more favorable tenancy agreements, and better treatment. Nobles who adapted by negotiating or granting concessions often preserved estates and influence, while those who resisted faced unrest or abandonment of lands. Epidemics accelerated shifts in social structures that might otherwise have taken generations, emphasizing the interplay between survival, economics, and human resilience. Political power was also affected. Leadership was tested not just in battle but in crisis management. Lords who organized resources, enforced hygiene, and protected populations strengthened loyalty and influence. Those who failed to address the threat faced rebellion, loss of authority, or even the collapse of their estates. Epidemics were a force that transcended traditional warfare. The ability to survive and maintain control during pestilence became a critical measure of competence. Culturally, the pervasive presence of death shaped perception, behavior, and belief. Art, literature, and religious practice reflected an acute awareness of mortality. Communities developed rituals for mourning, for health protection, and for appeasing perceived supernatural forces. These cultural adaptations influenced social cohesion, moral norms, and even law. Life in the shadow of pestilence taught societies to value preparation, prudence, and communal responsibility. Medical knowledge, though rudimentary, advanced in subtle ways. Observation of patterns, experimentation with remedies, and the development of isolation strategies created a foundation for public health practices centuries later. While understanding of pathogens was absent, the medieval response, quarantines, hygienic measures, and controlled access demonstrated empirical adaptation to an invisible threat. Survival required systematic observation, recording of outcomes, and implementation of learned strategies. The psychological legacy was profound. Communities confronted the fragility of life constantly. Daily existence was marked by awareness of mortality, unpredictability, and the limits of human control. This cultivated resilience, strategic thinking, and caution. Individuals and families learned to prioritize resources, manage risk, and make difficult decisions under uncertainty. Fear, grief, and adaptation became intertwined in the fabric of daily life. At the individual level, survival depended on vigilance, adaptability, and prudence. Nobles monitored movement of people and goods, implemented isolation measures, and ensured food and water security. Peasants practiced avoidance, cautious interaction, and resource management. Knowledge, observation, and disciplined behavior often outweighed status or wealth in determining who lived and who perished. Communities evolved in response. Villages consolidated, estates were reorganized, and labor systems adjusted. Epidemics accelerated social change, including shifts in land use, economic practices, and legal structures. Survivors assumed new roles, redefined authority, and rebuilt social networks. Disease acted as a crucible, forcing adaptation that had lasting consequences for population distribution, social hierarchy, and governance. Even warfare and diplomacy were affected. Armies reduced in size, sieges delayed, and campaigns recalibrated in response to outbreaks. Leaders had to consider the health of their forces alongside strategy, weaponry, and terrain. Epidemics became strategic variables, influencing when and where conflicts occurred. Success or failure increasingly depended on foresight and adaptability in the face of an invisible adversary. Ultimately, pestilence revealed the fragility and resilience of medieval life. Disease could topple armies, destabilize economies, and reshape societies without a single sword being drawn. Survival required observation, planning, and adaptability. The medieval world was not only a stage of battlefields and politics, but also a landscape dominated by invisible threats where human ingenuity, caution, and endurance determined the course of history. And so, the lingering reflection emerges. If epidemics could silently reshape society, redistribute power, and redefine survival, how many historical transformations were determined not by conquest or diplomacy, but by the quiet, relentless influence of disease and the human responses it provoked?